They worship power in the kingdom of Veralis, and tonight they're going to learn what real power looks like when you push a wolf too far. My name is Alara Ashthorn, and 3 hours ago the strongest alpha in this kingdom stood in front of hundreds of nobles and told the world I wasn't good enough to breathe the same air as him. He called me weak, worthless, a mistake written in weak blood. The entire hall laughed like it was the funniest joke they'd ever heard. But here's what Kael Draven didn't know when he shattered our mate bond in front of everyone. I've been carrying something in my blood that his precious royal council has spent 2 centuries trying to exterminate. And tonight, that something just woke up. Stick around until the end of this story, hit that like button, and drop your city in the comments so I know my pack is listening. The marble floor was cold beneath Alara's knees. She could feel every ridge of the stone biting through the thin fabric of her dress as she knelt in the center of the grand hall, surrounded by wolves who had spent their entire lives being told they were better than her. The scent of expensive wine and roasted meat hung thick in the air, mixing with the cloying sweetness of ceremonial incense that burned in silver bowls along the walls. Somewhere in the back of the hall, a woman laughed, sharp and cruel, and the sound echoed off the vaulted ceiling like broken glass raining down. Alara kept her eyes fixed on the floor. She had learned years ago that looking up only invited more pain. The Grand Moon Convocation happened once every 5 years, a gathering of every major pack in the kingdom to reaffirm alliances and settle territorial disputes under the gaze of the full moon. The Silver Fang Kingdom always hosted, because that was what power meant in Veralis. You didn't ask for space, you took it and dared anyone to tell you different. Tonight the hall was packed with over 300 wolves, all dressed in their finest ceremonial clothes, all wearing their status like armor. Alphas sat at the high tables with their chosen mates beside them, their children standing behind them in perfectly pressed uniforms that probably cost more than Alara's entire pack earned in a year. Lower-ranked wolves filled the remaining spaces, servants mostly, keeping their heads down and their movements quiet. Alara belonged to neither group. She was from Black Hollow, a dying border pack that clung to the edge of the kingdom like a tumor nobody bothered to cut out. Her dress was second-hand, altered 3 times to fit her smaller frame, and the embroidery along the hem was coming loose where her cousin had sewn it too quickly the night before. She wore no jewelry because her family owned none. Her hair was pulled back in a simple braid because there was no one left in her pack who remembered how to do the elaborate styles that marked noble bloodlines. She was 22 years old, and she had been invisible her entire life. Until 6 months ago, when the mate bond snapped into place during a border negotiation, and she realized with absolute horror that the other end was tied to Kael Draven, the future High Alpha of the Silver Fang Kingdom. A man who could trace his bloodline back 12 generations without a single weak link. A man worshipped like a god by wolves who thought power was the only thing worth respecting. Alara had felt the bond lock into place like a chain wrapping around her ribs, squeezing until she couldn't breathe. She had looked across the negotiation tent and seen Kael's expression shift, just for a second, before his face went completely blank. He had felt it too. And then he had walked out without saying a single word. For 6 months, Alara had carried the bond in silence, feeling Kael's presence like a constant weight pressing against her chest. She felt when he was angry, when he was tired, when he was training until his muscles screamed. The bond fed her emotions she didn't ask for and couldn't block, tying her to a man who had made it clear through his complete absence that she meant less than nothing. She never told anyone. What would be the point? Everyone already knew what happened when an alpha like Kael got stuck with a mate from a pack like Black Hollow. You rejected them. Publicly, if you wanted to make sure the message was clear. Alara had known it was coming. She had spent 6 months preparing herself for the inevitable moment when Kael would stand in front of his people and sever the bond that nature had forced on both of them. She told herself it would be quick, clean. A formality that would hurt for a few days and then fade into the background noise of her unremarkable life. She had been wrong. The rejection was supposed to happen in private, in a small room with only the necessary witnesses present. That was how it was always done. You didn't humiliate your rejected mate in front of the entire kingdom unless you wanted to send a message that went beyond simple incompatibility. Kael wanted to send a message. He called her to the center of the grand hall 30 minutes into the feast, his voice carrying across the massive space with the kind of casual authority that made wolves twice his age lower their eyes. Alara had walked through the crowd with her heart hammering so hard she thought it might crack her ribs, feeling hundreds of eyes tracking her movement like predators watching wounded prey limp past. When she reached the center of the hall, Kael was already waiting. He stood on the raised dais reserved for the High Alpha's family, dressed in black ceremonial armor that had been polished until it reflected the candlelight like liquid shadow. His dark hair was pulled back from his face, revealing features that were sharp enough to cut. High cheekbones, a jaw that looked carved from stone, eyes the color of winter storms, cold and distant and completely devoid of anything that looked like mercy. He was beautiful in a way that dangerous things were beautiful, the kind of beauty that made you forget it could kill you until it was too late. Alara stopped 3 feet from the dais and dropped into the formal, submissive crouch that protocol demanded when a lower-ranked wolf addressed an alpha. Her knees hit the marble hard enough to bruise, but she didn't make a sound. The hall went quiet. Kael looked down at her with an expression that managed to be both bored and vaguely disgusted, like she was a problem he was tired of dealing with. Then he spoke. Alara Ashthorn of the Black Hollow Pack. 6 months ago, nature saw fit to tie us together through a mate bond neither of us requested. His voice was calm, measured, the kind of tone you used when discussing crop yields or border patrols. I have given this situation considerable thought. I consulted with my advisors, my family, and the Royal Council. We all reached the same conclusion. He paused, letting the silence stretch until it felt like the air itself was holding its breath. You are weak. Your bloodline is diluted beyond recognition. Your pack is dying because it lacks the strength to survive in a kingdom that rewards power above all else. To bind myself to you would be to weaken the Silver Fang Kingdom at a time when we cannot afford weakness. Someone in the crowd laughed. The sound broke something inside Alara's chest. Kael continued without acknowledging the interruption. Therefore, in front of these witnesses and under the gaze of the full moon, I reject you as my mate. I sever the bond between us. I cast you out from any claim you might have had on my bloodline, my pack, or my future. The formal words hung in the air like smoke. Alara felt the bond shudder inside her chest, recognizing the rejection and beginning the process of tearing itself apart. Pain bloomed behind her ribs, sharp and sudden, like someone had reached inside her chest and started pulling her heart out through her spine. She gasped despite herself. The crowd murmured, and Kael looked down at her with something that might have been satisfaction flickering behind his cold eyes. Do you accept this rejection, Alara Ashthorn? That was how it was supposed to end. She was supposed to say yes, lower her head, walk out of the hall with whatever dignity she had left and go back to Black Hollow where she could break down in private. But Alara didn't say yes. She stayed crouched on the marble floor with her heart tearing itself apart inside her chest, and she thought about her mother, who died when Alara was 8 years old, her mother, who used to wake up screaming in the middle of the night from dreams she would never talk about, her mother, who told Alara 3 days before she died that some bloodlines were too dangerous to be allowed to survive, and that safety sometimes meant hiding in plain sight where no one would ever think to look. Alara had never understood what her mother meant, until now, because the pain of the rejection was spreading through her body like fire, and underneath that pain was something else, something older, something that felt like it had been sleeping for a very long time and was extremely unhappy about being woken up. Heat bloomed in Alara's chest, not the emotional heat of anger or humiliation, but actual physical warmth that spread through her veins like someone had replaced her blood with liquid flame. Her skin started to prickle. Her hands started to shake. And somewhere very far away, buried under centuries of deliberate forgetting, something ancient cracked open inside her soul and began to burn. Alara lifted her head. She looked at Kael for the first time since entering the hall, meeting his cold eyes with something that made him take a half-step back despite himself. Then she spoke, and her voice came out rough and steady and absolutely certain. No. The single word cut through the hall like a blade. Kael's expression flickered with confusion. What did you say? Alara pushed herself to her feet, ignoring the pain still tearing through her chest. The heat inside her was building now, spreading from her core out into her limbs, making her fingertips tingle and her vision sharpen until she could see individual dust motes floating in the candlelight. I said no. I don't accept your rejection, Kael Draven. The crowd erupted into shocked whispers. Kael's jaw tightened. You don't have a choice.
Yes, I do. The old laws are clear. A rejected mate has the right to reject in return. So that's what I'm doing. Alara took a step forward, and several wolves in the front row actually leaned back. I reject you as my mate. I sever the bond between us. I cast you out from any claim you might have had on my blood, my future, or my loyalty. The bond between them shrieked inside her chest like it was being ripped apart by opposing forces. Alara felt her knees buckle, but she locked them in place through sheer stubbornness, refusing to fall in front of these people again. The heat inside her exploded outward. For just a second, less than a heartbeat, Alara felt something massive move inside her blood. Something with teeth and fire and a rage that had been building for 200 years. The marble beneath her feet cracked. A hairline fracture spread out from where she stood, spiderwebbing across the polished floor in a pattern that looked almost deliberate. The temperature in the hall spiked so fast that several wolves near the front actually pulled back, their eyes wide with confusion and something that looked almost like fear. Then the moment passed. The heat vanished as quickly as it appeared, sucking back into Alara's core and leaving her feeling hollowed out and shaking. Her vision blurred. Her legs gave out. She hit the floor hard, barely catching herself on her hands. The hall was completely silent. Alara looked up through the tangled mess of her hair and saw Kael staring at her with an expression she couldn't read. Behind him, several members of the Royal Council had risen from their seats, their faces pale and their eyes locked on the cracked marble beneath her. One of them, an older man with silver streaking his dark hair, leaned over and whispered something to the High Alpha that made the man's expression go very still. Then Kael spoke again, and this time there was something new in his voice, something that sounded almost like concern. "Get her out of here." Two guards moved forward immediately, grabbing Alara by her arms and hauling her to her feet. She tried to pull away, but her body wasn't responding properly. Everything felt distant and muffled, like she was watching the scene happen to someone else. The guards dragged her toward the side entrance, and the crowd parted like water, everyone stepping back to give them space. As they pulled her past the high tables, Alara caught a glimpse of her pack's representatives sitting in the back corner. Her cousin Marcus had his head in his hands. The pack beta, a woman named Sarah, who had helped raise Alara after her mother died, was staring at the cracked marble with an expression of absolute horror. They knew something. Everyone seemed to know something except Alara. The guard shoved her through a side door and into a narrow service corridor that smelled like old stone and lamp oil. They didn't speak as they hauled her down the hallway and out into a small courtyard where a single carriage waited. Black Hollow's carriage, shabby and worn compared to the polished vehicles belonging to the noble families. The guards threw Alara into the back and slammed the door. She heard one of them say something to the driver, too quiet for her to make out the words, and then the carriage lurched into motion. Alara collapsed against the worn bench seat and tried to make sense of what had just happened. She had rejected him back. She had cracked the floor. She had felt something wake up inside her blood that felt nothing like the weak, forgettable wolf everyone believed her to be. And the Royal Council had looked at her like they were seeing a ghost. The carriage ride back to Black Hollow took 3 hours, and Alara spent most of it staring out the window at the dark forest rolling past and trying to remember everything her mother had ever said about their family. It wasn't much. Her mother had been secretive about their bloodline in a way that went beyond simple privacy. She refused to discuss Alara's father beyond saying he was dead. She burned every family record she could find. She taught Alara to keep her head down, and her wolf buried so deep that most people forgot she had one. When Alara asked why, her mother would just say that some families attracted the wrong kind of attention, and that survival meant making yourself invisible. But invisible from what? Alara pressed her forehead against the cold glass and watched her breath fog the window. The heat inside her chest had faded to a dull ember, barely noticeable unless she focused on it. But it was still there, waiting. Whatever had woken up inside her during the rejection, it hadn't gone back to sleep. It was watching, waiting, learning the shape of the cage it had been locked inside for 22 years. The carriage rolled into Black Hollow just before dawn, pulling to a stop outside the pack house with a creak of old wood and tired horses. Alara climbed out on shaking legs and stood in the empty street, looking at the building that had been her home for her entire life. It was smaller than she remembered, shabbier. The paint was peeling off the wooden siding and several of the windows were cracked. The front steps sagged in the middle where too many years of feet had worn down the wood. Even the pack symbol carved above the door, a wolf's head surrounded by oak leaves, looked faded and half forgotten. This was what Kyle had seen when he looked at her, this dying, desperate place clinging to relevance by its fingernails. Alara walked up the steps and pushed open the front door. The main hall was empty except for Sarah, who sat at one of the long tables with her hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had gone cold hours ago. She looked up when Alara entered, and the expression on her face made Alara's stomach drop. Sarah looked terrified. "What happened?" Alara asked. Sarah stood up slowly, like she was afraid any sudden movement might shatter something fragile. "We need to talk, now, before the others wake up." She gestured toward the small office at the back of the hall, the one that used to belong to the Pack Alpha before he died and left Black Hollow without clear leadership. Sarah led the way inside and closed the door firmly behind them. Then she turned to face Alara, and her hands were shaking. "Tell me exactly what happened in that hall." So Alara told her. She described the rejection, the words Kyle had used, the way the crowd had laughed. She described the pain of the bond tearing apart and the strange heat that had bloomed inside her chest. She described the marble cracking and the way the Royal Council had looked at her like they were seeing something impossible. When she finished, Sarah was gripping the edge of the desk so hard her knuckles had gone white. "Oh, gods," she breathed. "They're going to come for you." "Who?" "The Council. The Silver Fang Kingdom. Every powerful pack in Veyr who remembers what your bloodline used to be." Sarah moved to the window and pulled the curtain back just enough to peer out at the empty street. "Your mother made me promise never to tell you. She thought if you didn't know, if you stayed weak and unremarkable, they might leave you alone. But that bond breaking in front of everyone—" She turned back to Alara with tears in her eyes. "You cracked the marble, Alara. Do you understand what that means? Ordinary wolves don't do that. Not even alphas. That kind of power only comes from one place." Alara felt something cold settle in her stomach. "What place?" Sarah took a breath that sounded painful. "Your mother was Ember Wolf, one of the last survivors of a bloodline this kingdom spent 2 centuries trying to exterminate. And from the way you just described what happened in that hall, I'd say the dormant genes just woke up." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Alara stared at Sarah, waiting for the punchline, waiting for this to make sense in some way that didn't completely rewrite everything she thought she knew about herself. But Sarah just looked back at her with an expression that was equal parts grief and resignation. "That's impossible," Alara said finally. "The Ember Wolves are extinct. Everyone knows that. They were wiped out during the Purge. Not all of them. Your mother escaped. She hid here in Black Hollow because it was so weak and forgotten that no one thought to look. She met your father, had you, and spent every day of your life trying to make sure you never gave anyone a reason to remember what her bloodline used to be capable of." "And what were they capable of?" Sarah's expression went very still. "Fire. Not the metaphorical kind, the actual kind. Ember wolves could summon flames with their bare hands, melt steel, burn through enchanted weapons like they were paper. In their war form, they were practically unstoppable. That's why the royal families exterminated them. They were too dangerous to be allowed to exist." The cold in Alara's stomach was spreading now, creeping up into her chest until she could barely breathe. "So what you're saying is that I'm dangerous," Sarah interrupted. "You're dangerous, Alara. And the moment that marble cracked, you announced it to every powerful wolf in the kingdom." She moved away from the window and grabbed Alara's shoulders, forcing her to meet her eyes. "Listen to me very carefully. The Royal Council knows what you are. They've probably known for years. Your mother's death wasn't an accident. They killed her because she was starting to show signs of her power returning, and they would have killed you too if you hadn't been so perfectly unremarkable. But now you've stopped being unremarkable." Alara jerked back. "You're saying the Council murdered my mother?" "Yes. And they're going to try to murder me?" "Yes. Why would they do that? What threat could I possibly—" Sarah laughed, bitter and sharp. "You really don't understand, do you? The entire social order of this kingdom is built on the idea that strength determines worth. The Alphas rule because they're the strongest. The noble families maintain power because their bloodlines are pure and their wolves are dominant. But Ember Wolves broke that system. They weren't just strong, they were apocalyptic. A single Ember Wolf in full war form could level an entire pack territory. They didn't need alliances or politics or careful breeding programs. They just needed to exist, and everyone else had to accept being second best. So the kingdom killed them all. Officially, it was because they were unstable and dangerous. Unofficially, it was because the noble families couldn't stand the idea of a bloodline they couldn't control or match. Sarah's grip on Alara's shoulders tightened. Your mother understood that. That's why she hid. That's why she kept you weak. Because the moment you show even a fraction of what you're capable of, you become an existential threat to every powerful family in Veyr, and they will kill you for it. Alara pulled away and collapsed into the chair behind the desk, her mind racing. This was insane. All of it. She wasn't special. She wasn't dangerous. She was just a girl from a dying pack who had gotten unlucky enough to be tied to an alpha who wanted nothing to do with her. Except she had cracked marble just by standing on it, and she had felt something massive wake up inside her blood when the mate bond shattered, and the Royal Council had looked at her like they were seeing a nightmare come back to life. What do I do? She asked quietly. Sarah was silent for a long moment. Then she said, Run.
What? Get out of Black Hollow.
Tonight. Before they send assassins or peacekeepers or whatever polite term they use for wolves, whose job is to murder inconvenient bloodlines. I can't just leave. This is my home. Your home will bury you if you stay. Sarah moved to the desk and started pulling out papers, old maps, supply lists. There's a place in the Ashvale Marsh, deep in the Eastern Territories, where the land is too cursed for most packs to follow. Your mother told me about it once. She said there was someone there. Someone who might be able to help if you ever... She stopped herself. If you ever became what you are. Alara looked at the maps spreading across the desk and felt reality tilt sideways. 12 hours ago, she had been nobody. Now she was being told to run for her life from the most powerful kingdom in the territory because her blood carried something that kings had tried to exterminate centuries ago. Who's supposed to be in the marsh? She asked. I don't know. Your mother never gave me a name. She just said there was someone who survived the purge. Someone who still remembers what the Ember Wolves were before the kingdom turned them into monsters in everyone's memory. A knock on the door made both women freeze. Sarah moved to the door and cracked it open just enough to see who was outside. Ronan. Her voice carried relief. The door opened wider and a young man stepped inside, closing it quickly behind him. He was maybe a year older than Alara, lean and scarred from years of working as a border scout. His dark eyes flicked between Sarah and Alara with the kind of sharp intelligence that came from spending too much time in dangerous places. I heard what happened at the convocation, he said without preamble. Everyone heard. The whole kingdom is talking about how the weakest wolf in Veyr rejected Kael Draven in front of the entire nobility and cracked the floor doing it. He looked directly at Alara. They're saying you're Ember Wolf. Alara said nothing. Ronan's expression didn't change. Good. About time someone reminded this kingdom that power doesn't always come with a fancy bloodline certificate. He pulled a pack off his shoulder and dropped it on the desk. I'm guessing Sarah's already told you to run. So I brought supplies, food, medical kit, weapons, everything you'll need to reach the Ashvale Marsh and survive once you get there. Why are you helping me? Alara asked. Because I've spent 5 years watching this pack pretend you don't exist. And I'm tired of it. Ronan met her eyes with something that looked almost like respect. You stood up in front of the most powerful alpha in the kingdom and told him he wasn't good enough for you. That's the first interesting thing anyone from Black Hollow has done in a decade. I'm not letting them kill you for it. Sarah was already checking the supplies in the pack, her movements quick and efficient. You'll need to leave within the hour. Before dawn. The council will send someone as soon as they finish the convocation closing ceremonies. What about the rest of the pack? Alara asked. They'll be fine. Black Hollow is too insignificant to punish for your actions. The council will make examples out of you and move on. Ronan pulled out one of the maps and spread it flat. The fastest route is through the southern forest. It's rough terrain but fewer patrols. Once you hit the border markers, you'll be in unclaimed territory. From there, it's about 2 days hard travel to reach the outer edge of the marsh. He traced the route with his finger, marking safe points and places to avoid. I'll come with you. You'll need someone who knows how to move through hostile territory without being tracked. Alara looked at him, then at Sarah, then down at the maps covering the desk. This was real. This was actually happening. She was about to run from the only home she'd ever known because her blood carried something so terrifying that an entire kingdom had spent centuries trying to wipe it out. And somewhere inside her chest, beneath the fear and confusion and exhaustion, that ember of heat pulsed once like a heartbeat. like it was agreeing. "Fine," Alara said. "We leave in an hour." Sarah pulled her into a fierce hug that smelled like tea and old paper and every stable thing Alara had ever known. "Your mother would be proud," she whispered. Terrified, but proud. She pulled back and gripped Alara's face between her hands. "Don't let them make you into a monster, Alara. Whatever power is in your blood, it's yours, not theirs. You decide what it means." Alara nodded, not trusting her voice. Ronan was already gathering the supplies and rolling up the maps. 1 hour, he repeated. "Pack light. Move fast." Alara climbed the stairs to her small room one last time and looked around at the space that had been hers for 22 years. The narrow bed with its faded quilt, the cracked mirror above the dresser, the window that looked out over the empty street. She changed into practical traveling clothes, sturdy pants, and a shirt that wouldn't catch on branches. She packed a single bag with clothes, a few personal items, and the only thing her mother had left her, a small leather journal filled with pressed flowers and notes written in a language Alara had never learned to read. When she came back downstairs, Ronan was waiting by the door with both packs slung over his shoulders. Sarah pressed a small pouch into Alara's hands. "Money. Not much, but enough to buy supplies if you need them." Then she stepped back and forced a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Go, before I change my mind and chain you to the basement." Alara and Ronan slipped out the back door as the first gray light of dawn started creeping over the horizon. They moved through the empty streets of Black Hollow, like ghosts, keeping to the shadows and avoiding the few wolves who were already awake and moving around. At the edge of the village, they paused long enough for Alara to look back one more time. Her pack. Her home. Everything she was walking away from because she had finally stopped being invisible. Then Ronan touched her arm, and they disappeared into the forest. They walked for 6 hours straight, moving fast and stopping only when Ronan spotted signs of other wolves nearby. The forest this far south was dense and old, the kind of place where the trees grew so thick that sunlight barely reached the ground. Twice they heard patrols in the distance and had to detour around clearings where border scouts would have clear sightlines. By midday, Alara's legs were burning and her shoulders ached from the weight of her pack, but she didn't complain. Ronan was right. They got caught now before she understood what was happening inside her blood. She wouldn't stand a chance against trained soldiers. They stopped beside a stream to refill their water bottles and eat a quick meal of dried meat and hard bread. Alara sat on a flat rock and watched the water flow past while Ronan scouted the area. When he came back, he looked grim. 3 sets of tracks heading south, fresh, maybe an hour old. Heading toward the marsh? He nodded. "They're already looking for you. Whoever the council sent, they're not wasting time. Can we avoid them?" "Maybe. But it means going deeper into rough territory, the kind of places where the land itself is dangerous." Alara stood and adjusted her pack. "Then that's where we go." They walked until the sun started sinking below the horizon, and the forest around them began to shift. The trees grew twisted and strange, their bark marked with patterns that looked almost deliberate. The undergrowth became thicker, thornier, catching at their clothes and skin. The air started to smell wrong, sulfuric and damp, like rot and mineral springs mixed together. "This is it," Ronan said quietly. "The outer edge of the Ashvale Marsh." "How far until we reach whoever Sarah said might be here?" "I don't know. The map only marks the entry points. Everything past here is uncharted." They pushed forward as darkness fell, and the marsh welcomed them with all the warmth of a grave waiting for its next occupant. The ground became soft and treacherous, forcing them to test every step before committing their weight. Strange sounds echoed through the twisted trees, things that might have been birds or might have been something else entirely. Twice, Alara caught glimpses of eyes reflecting the moonlight from the darkness between the trees, watching them pass with predatory stillness. Ronan kept his hand on the knife at his belt and his eyes on the path ahead. They were 3 hours into the marsh when Alara heard the howl. It came from behind them, distant but unmistakable. A hunting cry designed to carry across miles of open territory. The council's wolves had found their trail. "Run," Ronan said. They crashed through the marsh, abandoning stealth for speed. Branches whipped at their faces. Mud sucked at their boots. Behind them, the howls grew closer, coordinated. The sound of a trained pack closing in on wounded prey. Alara's lungs burned. Her legs screamed. But she kept moving because stopping meant dying, and she hadn't come this far just to die in a swamp. Then the ground beneath her feet gave way. She dropped into cold water that closed over her head, thick and dark and suffocating. For a second, she couldn't tell which way was up. Then Ronan's hand grabbed her arm and hauled her back to the surface. They were in a shallow pool surrounded by ancient trees whose roots twisted down into the water like skeletal fingers. And standing on the far bank was a woman. She was old, her hair silver and her face marked with scars that looked like they'd been earned in battles fought long before Alara was born. But her eyes were sharp and bright, and when she looked at Alara, something in her expression shifted. Recognition. "You're late," the woman said, her voice rough like gravel scraping stone. "I've been waiting 22 years for Mara's daughter to wake up and remember what she is." Behind them, the howls were getting closer. The woman gestured sharply. "Move, now, before they arrive and I have to kill them for trespassing." "Who are you?" Alara gasped. The woman smiled, cold and sharp as winter. "My name is Celine. I'm the last guardian of the Ember bloodline." She turned and started walking deeper into the marsh. "And you, girl, are about to learn exactly what your mother died protecting." Celine moved through the marsh like she had been born in it, her feet finding solid ground where Alara saw only water and mud. Ronan stayed close behind Alara, his hand still on his knife, his eyes scanning the darkness for whatever was hunting them. The howls had stopped. That was worse somehow. When predators went quiet, it meant they were close enough that noise would give away their position. It meant they were circling, cutting off escape routes, preparing for the kill. Alara's heart hammered against her ribs, but she forced herself to keep moving, following Celine deeper into a landscape that looked like it had been pulled from a fever dream. The trees here were massive and twisted, their trunks wider than 3 men standing side by side. Strange fungi grew in spiraling patterns up the bark, glowing with a faint bioluminescence that cast everything in shades of green and blue. The water reflected the light, making it look like they were walking through some drowned cathedral lit by ghost fires. "How much farther?" Ronan asked quietly. Celine didn't look back. "As far as it takes to lose the council's dogs." She led them across a fallen log that spanned a gap of dark water, then down into a ravine where the air smelled like copper and old blood. At the bottom, she stopped and held up one hand. Everyone froze. For a long moment, there was only silence and the distant sound of water dripping somewhere in the darkness. Then Celine spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "They're here. 3 of them. Trackers, probably. Council sends their best when they want someone disappeared quietly." "Can you lose them?" Alara asked. Celine turned and looked at her with eyes that held something between pity and contempt. "I don't need to lose them, girl. I need to teach you how to kill them." "What? You think running is going to save you? You think hiding in a swamp is a long-term survival strategy?" Celine moved closer, and even though she was half a foot shorter than Alara, there was something about her presence that made Alara take a step back. "Your mother tried hiding, spent 22 years making herself small and forgettable and praying the kingdom would leave her alone. You know what that got her? A knife in the dark and an unmarked grave." She grabbed Alara's wrist and pressed her thumb against the pulse point. "You've got ember blood. That means you're already dead as far as the council is concerned. The only question is whether you die running or die fighting." Alara jerked her hand away. "I don't know how to fight." "Then you're going to learn fast." A branch snapped somewhere in the darkness above them. Celine's expression went very still. "Get behind me, both of you, and whatever you see, whatever you feel, don't make a sound." She turned to face the ravine wall just as 3 shapes dropped from the trees above. They landed in a crouch, all 3 of them moving with the kind of fluid coordination that spoke of years working together. Trackers, just like Celine said, dressed in dark leather armor designed to blend into shadows. Their eyes reflected the fungal light like mirrors. The one in the center stood slowly, his gaze fixed on Celine. "Guardian." His voice was calm, respectful even. "We have no quarrel with you. Give us the girl, and we'll leave your territory in peace." Celine tilted her head slightly. "You're standing in my territory right now. That means you already broke the peace." The tracker's expression didn't change. "The council authorized this hunt. The girl is Ember bloodline. You know the laws. I know the laws your kingdom wrote after they murdered mine.
I know you called us monsters so you'd feel better about the genocide. I know you sent 3 trackers into my swamp because you're too afraid to send an army." She took a step forward, and all 3 trackers tensed. "What I don't know is why you think those things give you the right to take one of my blood from under my protection. She's not under your protection. She's a criminal." She used forbidden power in the Grand Hall.
Celine laughed, sharp and bitter. Forbidden power. That's what you're calling it now? She cracked some marble because your precious High Alpha was cruel enough to wake up something that should have stayed sleeping. That's not criminal. That's justice. The tracker's hand moved to the weapon at his belt. "This is your last warning, Guardian. Step aside or we'll consider you an accomplice. Try it." The word hung in the air like a blade. For one heartbeat, everything was perfectly still. Then the trackers moved. They were fast, faster than Alara had ever seen wolves move. They came at Celine from 3 directions at once, their movements coordinated with the kind of precision that only came from hunting together for years. Celine was faster. She shifted mid-stride, but not into a normal wolf form. Her body expanded and twisted, bones cracking and reforming into something that stood upright, like a human but was covered in dark fur that seemed to absorb light. Her hands became claws the length of daggers. Her face elongated into something that was more predator than anything Alara had words for. This was the war form Sarah had described, the thing that made ember wolves so terrifying that an entire kingdom decided they were too dangerous to exist. The first tracker didn't even have time to scream. Celine's claws tore through his throat and chest in one smooth motion, so fast that his body was hitting the ground before the blood started to spray. The second tracker managed to get a blade out, but Celine grabbed his wrist and twisted, snapping bone with a sound like green wood breaking. He dropped to his knees and she drove her other hand through his chest, crushing his heart, before ripping her claws free in a spray of red. The third tracker ran. He made it maybe 10 feet before Celine's hand closed around the back of his neck and slammed him face first into a tree trunk with enough force to crack the bark. He slumped to the ground and didn't move. The entire fight lasted less than 15 seconds. Celine stood over the bodies, breathing hard, her war form still rippling with barely contained violence. Blood dripped from her claws and steamed where it hit the cold water pooling at her feet. Then she shifted back. The transformation reversed itself just as violently, bones cracking back into human configuration, fur receding, claws shrinking. Within seconds, she was just an old woman again, standing in the middle of 3 corpses like she was waiting for someone to serve her tea. She turned to look at Alara and Ronan. "That's what you are. That's what your mother was. That's what this kingdom is so afraid of that they'll send killers into cursed swamps just to make sure it never wakes up again." Alara couldn't speak, couldn't move. Her mind was still trying to process what she had just witnessed. Ronan broke the silence. "How long can you hold that form?" Celine wiped blood off her hands using a dead tracker's cloak. "Hours if I need to, days if I'm motivated. Ember wolves don't tire the way normal wolves do. The fire burns through exhaustion, through pain, through everything except death itself." She looked at Alara. "You'll need to learn it. The shift, the form, how to channel the heat without burning yourself from the inside out." "I can't do that." "You already did. You cracked marble, girl. That's your bloodline trying to manifest without knowing how. Left unchecked, it'll tear you apart from the inside." "I've seen it happen. Watched a boy about your age burn himself to ash because nobody taught him control." Celine started walking again, stepping over bodies like they were fallen logs. "Come on, we're not safe here." Where there's 3 trackers, there's usually a handler waiting to report back. We need to reach the inner territories before they send reinforcements. This time neither Alara nor Ronan argued. They followed Celine deeper into the marsh, leaving the corpses behind for whatever scavengers called this place home. They walked for another hour through increasingly hostile terrain. The water got deeper, the air got colder. Things moved in the darkness that Alara tried very hard not to think about. Finally, Celine stopped at what looked like a solid wall of tangled roots and vines. She pressed her hand against a specific point and something clicked. The wall swung inward, revealing a narrow passage that led down into the earth. "Home, sweet home," she said without emotion. The passage opened into a series of caves that had been carved and shaped over decades into something resembling living quarters. There were rooms branching off from a central chamber, some filled with supplies, others with weapons. one that looked like it had been set up as a training area, complete with practice dummies and weight stones. Everything was old but well-maintained, functional, the kind of space someone built when they expected to spend the rest of their life hiding from the world above. Celine lit several oil lamps, and the caves came alive with flickering yellow light. "You'll stay here while I teach you, both of you." She pointed at Ronan. "You're not Ember Blood, but you can still learn to fight properly. Most border scouts know how to track and hide. I'll teach you how to kill." Then she turned to Alara. "And you're going to learn what it means to be what you are. Not the watered-down version your mother tried to pretend existed. The real thing. The war form. The fire. All of it." "How long will that take?" Alara asked. Celine shrugged. "Depends on how fast you learn and how much you want to survive. Some wolves take months to master the shift. Others never do. They burn themselves out trying and die screaming." She moved to a cabinet and started pulling out dried meat and hard bread. "We'll start tomorrow. Tonight you eat, you sleep, and you try not to think too hard about the fact that your entire life just ended and something new is beginning whether you like it or not." It wasn't a comforting speech, but Alara supposed comfort wasn't really the point anymore. They ate in silence, too tired and too overwhelmed to make conversation. Ronan kept glancing at the passage entrance like he expected more trackers to come pouring through at any moment. Alara just stared at her hands and tried to remember what it felt like when the marble cracked beneath her feet. That heat. That pulse of power. It was still there, coiled in her chest like a sleeping animal. Waiting. When they finished eating, Celine showed them to a side chamber with 2 bedrolls and a single lamp. "Get some rest. Training starts at dawn." She left without waiting for a response. Alara collapsed onto one of the bedrolls and closed her eyes, but sleep wouldn't come. Every time she started to drift off, she saw Celine's war form tearing through those trackers, like they were made of paper. She saw the blood, the speed, the absolute absence of mercy. That's what she was supposed to become. Ronan's voice cut through the darkness. "You okay?" "No." "Yeah, me neither." Silence stretched between them. Then Ronan spoke again, quieter this time. "For what it's worth, I don't think you're a monster." Alara opened her eyes and stared at the cave ceiling. "You saw what Celine did to those trackers. I saw what the trackers were planning to do to you. Sometimes the only difference between a monster and a survivor is who's telling the story." That was probably true. It didn't make Alara feel any better. She closed her eyes again, and eventually exhaustion dragged her down into a sleep full of fire and blood and marble cracking beneath her feet. Dawn in the caves meant Celine walking in and kicking the bottom of Alara's bedroll hard enough to jolt her awake. Up. Now. We're burning daylight. "There is no daylight down here," Alara mumbled. "Then we're burning darkness. Move." Training started immediately, and it was brutal. Celine led Alara to the chamber set up as a training area and pointed to the center of the floor where someone had carved a circle into the stone. "Stand there. Close your eyes. Find the heat inside your chest." Alara did as instructed, feeling stupid and self-conscious. Nothing happened. Stop thinking about it and feel it. The fire doesn't respond to your mind. It responds to your instincts, your rage, your fear. Find the thing that makes you want to survive and grab it. Alara tried for 10 minutes and got nothing except a headache. Celine watched with her arms crossed and her expression completely neutral. "You're holding back." "I'm not." "Yes, you are. You're afraid of what happens if you let it out. Afraid you'll lose control. Afraid you'll become something you can't recognize." She moved closer. "Let me tell you something about control, girl. You don't control the fire by strangling it. You control it by riding it, by becoming the thing you're afraid of and deciding what that thing means." Celine stepped into the circle with her. "Hit me." "What?" "You heard me. Hit me. As hard as you can. I'm not going to do it, or I'll hit you first, and I promise you won't enjoy it." Alara swung a half-hearted punch that Celine blocked without effort. "Pathetic. You're fighting like you're apologizing for taking up space, like you're sorry for existing. Is that what you want to be? An apology." She shoved Alara hard enough to make her stumble back. "Your mother spent her entire life apologizing for being Ember Blood. She made herself weak. She made herself invisible. She tried so hard to be something acceptable that she forgot how to be dangerous. Another shove, and they killed her anyway. Because it didn't matter how small she made herself, the council was always going to see her as a threat that needed to be eliminated. Alara felt heat starting to build in her chest. So what's your plan? Hide in swamps for the rest of your life? Hope they forget about you? Die quiet so you don't inconvenience anyone? The heat was spreading now, crawling up into her shoulders and down into her arms. Or are you going to stand up and become the thing they're actually afraid of? Instead of the weak little border wolf who let Kael Draven humiliate her in front of hundreds of witnesses? Alara's vision went red. She swung again, and this time there was real force behind it. Her fist connected with Celine's shoulder, and the older woman actually stepped back, her eyes lighting up with something that looked almost like approval. Better. Again. They fought for an hour. Celine didn't hold back, and she didn't give Alara time to think. She pushed and prodded and insulted until Alara was too angry to be afraid. The heat in her chest built until it felt like her blood was boiling. Her muscles started to burn, but not from exhaustion, from something else, something that wanted out. "That's it," Celine said. "Feel it building. Don't push it down. Let it rise." Alara threw another punch, and halfway through the motion, her hand changed. Claws erupted from her fingertips, long and black and razor-sharp. Her bones cracked and shifted, her arm becoming longer, stronger, covered in dark fur that rippled like living shadow. She froze, staring at her transformed hand in shock and horror. "Don't stop." Celine's voice cut through the panic. "You're halfway there. Push through. I can't." "Yes, you can. The shift doesn't happen all at once unless you're in immediate danger. You have to coax it out piece by piece until your body remembers what it's supposed to be." Alara tried to pull the shift back, but it wouldn't respond. Her hand stayed locked in the war form, claws extended, muscles burning with a heat that felt both foreign and horribly familiar. "Now the other hand," Celine instructed. It took 20 minutes of painful concentration, but eventually Alara's other hand shifted as well. Then her feet, then her legs. Each transformation felt like her bones were being broken and reformed, like her body was being torn apart and rebuilt into something older than the shape she'd worn her entire life. By the end of the session, she was covered in sweat and shaking from exhaustion, but she'd managed a partial shift. Both arms and both legs in war form, her torso still human, her face unchanged. Celine nodded slowly. "Not bad for a first attempt. Most wolves pass out or throw up. You did neither. I feel like I'm going to do both. That's normal. The shift drains you until your body learns to channel the fire efficiently. Get some water, rest for an hour. Then we're doing it again." Alara staggered to the side chamber and collapsed next to the water barrel, scooping handfuls into her mouth with shaking hands. Her transformed limbs had reverted back to human shape, but she could still feel the echo of them, like phantom limbs waiting to be recalled. This was what she was. This was what the kingdom had tried to exterminate. She understood why. Looking at her own claws, feeling the raw power coiled in muscles that shouldn't exist, she could see why normal wolves would be terrified. This wasn't just strength. This was something that broke the natural order, something that made every other bloodline obsolete by comparison. No wonder the royal families killed them all. The training continued for days. Celine was relentless, pushing Alara through drill after drill, forcing her to hold the war form for longer periods, teaching her how to channel the heat without burning herself out. The pain was constant, but Alara started to understand it, started to recognize it not as something attacking her, but as something trying to emerge. Ronan trained separately, working with weapons and close-quarters combat techniques that looked like they'd been designed specifically for killing things bigger and stronger than himself. In the evenings, they'd sit together in the main chamber and eat whatever dried supplies Celine had stockpiled, too exhausted to talk much. But on the 5th night, Ronan finally asked the question Alara had been avoiding. "What are you going to do after you learn all this?" Alara stared into the fire burning in the central hearth. "I don't know. Because you can't hide here forever. Eventually the council is going to send more trackers, more soldiers. They'll keep coming until they overwhelm even Celine's defenses." "I know. So what's the plan? Run further? Find another swamp? Spend your whole life moving from one hiding place to another?" Alara didn't answer. Because Ronan was right. Running wasn't a solution. It was just postponing the inevitable. "What would you do?" she asked finally.
Ronan was quiet for a long moment. I'd make them regret coming after me. I'd walk back into that kingdom and show every wolf who laughed at you exactly what you've become. I'd make Kael Draven look at you and understand what he threw away. That's vengeance talking.
Maybe. But it's also strategy. Right now, the Council controls the narrative. They've painted you as a monster who needs to be eliminated for everyone's safety. If you hide, you confirm their story. But if you stand up and prove you're not what they say you are, I am what they say I am. You've seen the war form. You've seen what Selene can do. They're not wrong about us being dangerous. Dangerous isn't the same as evil. Ronan leaned forward, his expression intense. The Council eliminated the Ember Wolves because they couldn't control them, not because they were actually threatening anyone. That's not justice. That's genocide dressed up in legal language. So what? I'm supposed to march back to the capital and demand an apology? No. You're supposed to invoke the old laws and force them to face you on ground where they can't just send assassins in the dark. Alara looked at him. What old laws? The ones Sarah mentioned. The compensation laws. A rejected mate has the right to demand restitution through formal alpha trials. It's ancient law, built into the foundation of the kingdom. Even the council can't ignore it without undermining their own legitimacy. You're suggesting I demand a trial against Kael Draven? I'm suggesting you use the only legal weapon you have. Force them to face you in public. Make them justify why an entire bloodline had to die. Make them answer for your mother's murder in front of witnesses. It was insane. It was also the first plan that didn't involve running forever. Selene's voice cut through the conversation from where she sat in the shadows. The boy's not wrong. The council fears exposure more than they fear one rogue Ember Wolf. You walk into that arena with proof of what they've done, backed by the old laws they can't refuse without looking like tyrants, and you force them to deal with you as a person instead of a problem. And if they just kill me anyway, then you die fighting instead of hiding. Some would say that's an improvement. Alara stared into the fire and tried to imagine it, walking back into that grand hall, facing Kael again, invoking ancient laws in front of the same nobles who laughed when he rejected her. The idea terrified her. It also felt right in a way nothing else had since that night. I'd need proof, she said slowly. You said my father was trying to expose the council's conspiracy before he vanished. Do you know what happened to him? Selene was quiet for a long time. Then she stood and walked to one of the side chambers, returning a moment later with a leather satchel covered in dirt and dried blood. Your father came to me 15 years ago, said he'd found evidence that the council was systematically hunting down rare bloodlines, records of assassinations, orders signed by council members, testimony from wolves who'd witnessed the purges. She dropped the satchel on the floor in front of Alara. He left this with me for safekeeping, said if anything happened to him, I should give it to his daughter when she was ready. What happened to him? Selene met her eyes. Same thing that happened to your mother. They found him, killed him, made it look like an accident. Alara picked up the satchel with shaking hands. The leather was old but well preserved, the buckles still functional. Inside were dozens of documents, all carefully organized and annotated in handwriting she didn't recognize, but somehow knew belonged to her father. Orders for executions, lists of eliminated bloodlines, financial records showing council members being paid to hunt specific wolves. Her father had collected everything. This is enough, Ronan said quietly. This is proof the council can't deny. Selene nodded. It's enough to force a trial. Maybe even enough to bring down some of the old families if you play it right. She looked at Alara. But you need to understand something. The moment you walk into that arena, you stop being a victim. You become a threat, and the council will use every tool they have to eliminate you. I know. Do you? Because I've seen wolves with more training and experience than you get torn apart in formal duels. Kael Draven didn't become the future High Alpha by accident. He's probably the strongest fighter in the kingdom. Then I'll have to be stronger. The words came out with more confidence than Alara felt, but once they were spoken, she couldn't take them back. Selene smiled, cold and sharp. Good. Then we're moving to advanced training tomorrow. No more holding back, no more learning the basics. You're going to master the full war form or die trying. How long do I have? Until you can hold the form for an hour without passing out and fight me to a standstill. Once you can do that, you'll have a chance against Kael. And if I can't, then you'll die in that arena, and the last Ember Wolf will disappear from history. No pressure.
Elara looked down at the satchel full of her father's final work and felt something shift inside her chest. Not the heat this time. Something colder, harder. Determination. She'd spent 22 years being invisible, being weak, being the wolf everyone forgot about 5 seconds after looking at her. That version of Elara was gone. Burned away in the moment Kael Draven decided to humiliate her in front of the entire kingdom. What rose from those ashes wasn't going to be small or apologetic or easily dismissed. "When do we start?" she asked. Celine's smile widened. Now. The advanced training made everything that came before feel like a gentle warm-up. Celine didn't just push Elara into the war form. She dragged her there, forced her to hold it past the point of pain, past exhaustion, past the moment when every instinct screamed to let go and collapse. The fire in Alara's blood learned to burn hotter, brighter. The shift became faster, smoother, until she could drop into the war form in seconds instead of minutes. Her claws grew longer, her senses sharpened until she could hear Ronan's heartbeat from across the chamber and smell the sweat on Celine's skin. They sparred every day. Brutal matches that left Elara covered in cuts and bruises that healed faster than they should have. The fire burned through injuries, knitting flesh back together, pushing her body past normal limits. After 2 weeks, Elara could hold the war form for 30 minutes. After 3, she could hold it for an hour and still have enough energy left to fight. And somewhere in the middle of the 4th week, something changed. They were sparring like always. Celine coming at her with the kind of speed and precision that would have killed a normal wolf in seconds. Elara blocked and dodged, her war form responding to threats before her conscious mind could process them. Then Celine swept her legs out from under her, and Elara hit the ground hard. For a second, she was back in the grand hall, kneeling on cold marble, while hundreds of wolves laughed at her pain. The heat in her chest exploded. When Elara opened her eyes, she was standing in the center of the training circle, surrounded by flames. Actual flames dancing across her fur like living things, wrapping around her claws in spirals of orange and gold. The temperature in the cave spiked so fast that the water barrels against the walls started to steam. Celine took a step back, her expression shifting from aggressive to cautious. "Good," she breathed. "Now control it." "How?" "The same way you control the shift. Feel it, direct it, make it yours instead of letting it use you." Elara focused on the flames crawling across her arms. They responded to her attention, brightening where she concentrated, dimming where she pulled focus away. This was the fire Sarah had described, the thing that made Ember Wolves unstoppable. She could feel the potential in it, the destructive capacity. One wrong move, and she could turn this entire cave into an inferno. "Channel it into your claws," Celine instructed. "Concentrate the heat into a single point." It took several tries, but eventually Elara managed to pull the flames inward, funneling them down into her right hand until her claws glowed white-hot. When she slashed at one of the practice dummies, the wood didn't just split. It exploded into ash. Celine nodded slowly. "You're ready." "For what?" "To go back, to face the kingdom, to make them answer for what they've done." Elara let the war form drop, the flames dying as her body shifted back to human shape. She was breathing hard, but she wasn't exhausted. The fire sustained her now, burning away fatigue like it was nothing more than kindling. "When?" she asked. "Tomorrow. The Grand Council meets at the full moon to hear grievances and settle disputes. If you're going to invoke the old laws, that's when you do it." Celine walked over and placed a hand on Elara's shoulder. "Your father gave his life trying to expose the truth. Your mother died keeping you safe. Now it's your turn to decide what their sacrifices meant." She pulled her hand back. "But understand this. Once you walk into that chamber and demand a trial, there's no walking away. Win or lose, everything changes. The kingdom will never see you as just another forgotten border wolf again." "Good," Elara said quietly. "I'm done being forgotten." That night Elara couldn't sleep. She sat in the main chamber staring at the fire and thinking about everything that had brought her to this moment. The years of being invisible, the mate bond that should never have existed, the rejection that woke something up inside her blood that was never supposed to wake. Part of her was terrified. But another part, the part that had survived Kael's humiliation
and the Council's assassins and weeks of brutal training, was ready to stop running, ready to stand in front of the wolves who killed her parents and make them face what they'd done, ready to become the thing they feared instead of the thing they pitied. Ronan found her there just before dawn. "You're really going to do this," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes. Even though they might kill you anyway, especially because they might kill me anyway. Because if I'm going to die, I'd rather do it standing up instead of hiding in a cave waiting for the next group of assassins." Ronan sat down beside her. "Then I'm coming with you. You don't have to—" "Yes, I do. You walked into that grand hall alone once, and look what happened. You're not doing it again." Alara looked at him, this border scout who had no reason to tie his fate to hers except that he'd decided she was worth defending. "Thank you," she said quietly. He shrugged. "Someone's got to make sure you don't burn the whole kingdom down by accident." Despite everything, Alara smiled. They left the caves at dawn, following Celine back through the marsh and out into the forest beyond. The journey to the capital would take 3 days of hard travel. 3 days to prepare herself for what came next. 3 days before she walked into the Grand Council chamber and invoked the ancient right of Alpha trials against the most powerful wolf in the kingdom. 3 days before everything she'd become met. Everything she'd lost and forced the world to choose which version of Alara Ashthorn deserved to exist. She touched the satchel hanging at her side, feeling the weight of her father's evidence inside. This was it. The point where running stopped and standing began. The point where the forgotten border wolf became the thing nobles whispered about in the dark. The point of no return. The capital city of Valenhart looked exactly as Alara remembered it. Tall stone buildings pressed close together like wolves, jockeying for dominance. Streets paved with cobblestones worn smooth by centuries of feet. The scent of too many bodies living too close together, mixed with smoke from thousands of chimneys, and the underlying smell of ambition that seemed to seep from the very stones. They arrived at sunset on the 3rd day, entering through the southern gate with hoods pulled low and weapons hidden beneath their cloaks. Alara had expected to feel small walking through these streets again, diminished by the weight of all that power pressing down from the castle on the hill. Instead, she felt nothing but cold calculation. This city had murdered her parents, had laughed at her humiliation, had sent killers into the marsh to make sure she never became a threat. Now she was walking back into the heart of it, carrying proof of crimes that could bring down the oldest families in the kingdom. The irony was sharp enough to cut. They found an inn on the edge of the merchant district, the kind of place that asked no questions and remembered no faces. Ronan paid for a room with coins that didn't carry any pack markings, while Alara kept her head down and her presence muted. Celine had stayed behind in the marsh, claiming her face was too well known among the old families and her presence would draw attention before Alara was ready. The room was small and smelled like old smoke, but it had a lock on the door and a window that overlooked the street. Good enough. Ronan checked the window while Alara spread her father's documents across the bed, organizing them into categories. Assassination orders, financial records, witness testimony. Everything carefully annotated with dates and names and locations. Her father had been meticulous. He'd spent years building this case, tracking down survivors, gathering evidence that couldn't be dismissed as rumor or conspiracy. And the council had killed him before he could use it. But they hadn't found the documents. That was their mistake. "The Grand Council meets tomorrow at noon," Ronan said from his position by the window. "You'll need to get into the chamber before they start formal proceedings. Once the session begins, they won't allow interruptions." "How do I get in?" He turned to look at her. "You walk through the front door. The old laws are clear. Any wolf with a legitimate grievance can demand to be heard by the council. They can't refuse you without undermining the entire legal structure they built their power on. And if they try to have me arrested before I reach the chamber, then we fight our way out, and this plan fails before it starts." It wasn't reassuring, but it was honest. Alara gathered the documents back into the satchel and set it aside, then moved to the window to look out at the city spreading below. Somewhere up on that hill, Kyle Draven was probably sleeping in rooms larger than her entire pack house, completely unaware that the wolf he'd rejected was about to turn his entire world inside out. The thought should have brought satisfaction. Instead, it just made her tired. She didn't want revenge. She wanted answers, wanted to understand why her mother had to die, why her father had been silenced,
why an entire bloodline had been exterminated because they were born with power that made other wolves uncomfortable. Tomorrow, she'd get those answers, one way or another.
They left the inn 2 hours before noon, moving through streets that grew progressively more expensive and exclusive as they climbed toward the government district. Guards stood at intervals wearing the silver and black of the royal peacekeepers, their eyes tracking everyone who passed with the kind of professional paranoia that came from years of watching for threats. None of them stopped Alara. She kept her hood up and her presence small, just another wolf moving through the capital on legitimate business. Beside her, Ronan walked with the easy confidence of someone who belonged, his hand resting casually on the knife at his belt. The Grand Council chamber was built into the base of the castle itself, a massive stone building with columns carved to look like ancient trees. Wide steps led up to doors that stood 3 times the height of a normal wolf, reinforced with iron and marked with the royal crest. Alara climbed those steps with her heart hammering and her blood singing with heat that wanted to manifest as claws and fire. Not yet. She needed to get inside first, needed to be standing in front of the council with witnesses present before she revealed what she'd become. 2 guards stood at the doors, both wearing ceremonial armor that was probably functional despite looking decorative. They watched Alara approach with expressions that suggested they'd seen hundreds of petitioners and found all of them equally tiresome. "State your business," the one on the left said. Alara pushed her hood back and met his eyes. "I'm here to invoke the ancient right of formal grievance against the High Council." Both guards straightened slightly. The one on the right frowned. "Name and pack affiliation?" "Alara Ashthorn, Black Hollow Pack." Recognition flashed across both their faces. The one on the left actually took a step back, his hand moving toward the weapon at his belt. "You're supposed to be dead. I got better. Am I allowed entry, or are you planning to violate the old laws by denying a formal grievance?" The guards exchanged glances. There was a long moment where Alara thought they might actually refuse, might call for reinforcements, and have her dragged away before she could reach the council. Then the one on the right swore under his breath and pushed the door open. "You're allowed entry, but if you cause trouble, we're authorized to remove you by force." Noted. Alara walked through the doors with Ronan right behind her, and the weight of centuries of accumulated power pressed down like a physical thing. The council chamber was exactly as imposing as she'd imagined. Circular walls rose up to a domed ceiling painted with scenes of wolves in various stages of conquest and glory. Rows of seats descended in tiers toward a central floor where petitioners were expected to stand and present their cases. At the far end, elevated on a dais, sat the 12 members of the Grand Council. The session hadn't started yet, but the chamber was already half full with nobles and pack representatives waiting for proceedings to begin. They turned to look when Alara entered, and the wave of recognition that swept through the crowd was almost audible. Whispers started immediately. "That's the Ashthorn girl. I heard she was dead. What is she doing here? Someone call the peacekeepers." Alara ignored them all and walked down the center aisle toward the petitioner's circle marked in the floor. Her footsteps echoed in the vast space. Behind her, she could feel Ronan's presence, solid and steady, but she knew he couldn't follow her into the circle itself. Old laws required petitioners to stand alone when presenting grievances. She reached the circle and stepped inside. The conversations died. Every eye in the chamber fixed on her, and Alara felt the weight of their attention like wolves sizing up wounded prey. These were the people who had laughed at her rejection, who had watched Kyle tear her apart and found it entertaining. Now they looked confused, unsettled, like they were seeing something that shouldn't exist. Good. A door opened at the back of the dais, and the council members began filing in, taking their seats in order of seniority. Alara recognized most of them. Old wolves from powerful families, their authority written in every line of their faces. The last to enter was High Alpha Marcus Draven, Kyle's father. He moved with the kind of casual dominance that suggested he'd never questioned his right to rule. When he sat in the central chair, higher than all the others, the entire chamber seemed to hold its breath. His eyes found Alara, and something flickered across his expression. Surprise. Then calculation. Then something that looked almost like resignation. He knew what she was. Had probably known for years. Alara Ashthorn of Black Hollow Pack. High Alpha Marcus's voice carried across the chamber without effort.
You were declared a fugitive after assaulting royal peacekeepers and fleeing legal custody. What makes you think you have the right to stand in this chamber? Alara lifted her chin.
I assaulted no one. Your trackers came into the Ashvale Marsh to murder me. They failed, and I'm invoking the ancient right of formal grievance as outlined in the Covenant of Founding Laws. You can't refuse me without admitting the Council no longer respects the legal foundation it claims to uphold. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. High Alpha Marcus's jaw tightened. The laws you're citing are meant for wolves with legitimate claims, not fugitives. Then try me. Right here, right now. Present your evidence that I committed crimes. Let the Council and all these witnesses hear the charges and decide if they have merit. She knew he wouldn't, because trying her meant giving her a platform, meant letting her speak in front of hundreds of witnesses about what really happened in the marsh and why. Marcus knew that too. His eyes narrowed. What is your grievance? Alara reached into the satchel and pulled out the first document. Her father's handwriting was clear even from a distance. My grievance is that this council has spent 2 centuries systematically exterminating wolves whose bloodlines you deem too dangerous to control. You murdered the Ember Wolves. You killed my mother. You killed my father. And you've been hunting me since the moment I showed signs of being what they were. The chamber erupted. Nobles shouted denials. Pack representatives demanded proof. The council members were on their feet, 3 of them talking at once, their voices overlapping into chaos. High Alpha Marcus raised one hand and the noise died instantly. Those are serious accusations. Do you have evidence? Alara held up the satchel. 15 years' worth. Assassination orders signed by council members. Financial records showing payments to hunters who specialized in eliminating rare bloodlines. Testimony from wolves who survived the purges and went into hiding. She pulled out another document. This is the order that killed my mother, signed by council member Tharion, dated 3 months before she died in what was officially ruled an accident. She let the paper fall to the floor where everyone could see it. This is the report detailing my father's investigation into council corruption. He was killed 6 days after submitting it for review. Another document hit the floor. This is a list of 47 wolves who were eliminated over the past 20 years because they carried genetic markers associated with rare abilities. 47 murders disguised as accidents, territorial disputes, or lawful executions. The pile of evidence grew with each document she produced. And this, she said, pulling out the final page, is the standing order authorizing my death, signed by 8 of the 12 council members currently sitting on that dais, dated 2 weeks after Kael Draven rejected me at the Grand Moon Convocation. She looked directly at High Alpha Marcus. My grievance is that this council is built on genocide and maintained through murder, and I'm demanding restitution under the ancient compensation laws. The silence that followed was absolute. Then one of the council members, a woman named Lydia with silver streaking her dark hair, stood slowly. Even if these documents are legitimate, and I'm not saying they are, what restitution could possibly address crimes of this magnitude? Alara smiled without warmth. Trial by combat. Me against the wolf whose rejection triggered the council's current attempt on my life. Winner takes all. She turned to look at the crowd, scanning faces until she found the one she was looking for. Kael Draven, I'm invoking the blood right of Alpha trial. You rejected me in front of hundreds of witnesses and called me too weak to stand beside you. Now I'm giving you a chance to prove it. Kael stood in the 3rd row, surrounded by his father's advisors. He looked exactly as Alara remembered. Sharp features, cold eyes. The kind of beauty that made you forget he was dangerous until it was too late. But now his expression showed something she'd never seen before. Uncertainty. You can't be serious, he said. I've never been more serious in my life. The old laws are clear. A rejected mate can demand trial by combat as compensation for public humiliation. I'm making that demand, right here, right now, in front of all these witnesses. She spread her arms wide. Unless the future High Alpha is afraid of a weak little border wolf? The insult hit its mark. Kael's expression went very still. I'm not afraid of you, then accept the challenge. High Alpha Marcus cut in before Kael could respond. This is ridiculous. The compensation laws were written for disputes between equals. You're not an alpha. You have no standing to demand single combat against my son. Alara let the heat in her chest rise to the surface. Let it build until she could feel it crawling under her skin like living fire. Then she shifted. The transformation happened in seconds. Her body expanded and twisted, bones cracking and reforming into the war form. Claws erupted from her fingertips, fur rippled across her arms and shoulders, her face elongated slightly, becoming something that was more predator than person. Flames danced across her claws. The entire chamber recoiled. Several nobles actually stumbled backward. Pack representatives grabbed for weapons that weren't there. Even the council members looked shaken, their carefully maintained composure cracking. High Alpha Marcus's face had gone completely white. Alara spoke, and her voice came out rough but clear. "I am Ember Wolf, last surviving heir of a bloodline you tried to exterminate. I have more right to demand this trial than anyone in this chamber." She let the flames brighten until they reflected off the polished floor. "Now, does Kael Draven accept my challenge? Or does the future High Alpha hide behind his father's counsel because he's afraid of facing what he created when he humiliated me?" The trap was perfect. If Kael refused, he looked weak. If he accepted, he had to fight a war form in front of hundreds of witnesses who would see exactly what the council had been trying to hide for centuries. Either way, the old narrative was broken. Kael pushed through the crowd and walked down to stand at the edge of the petitioner's circle. Up close, Alara could see tension in his jaw and the way his hands were clenched at his sides. But his voice was steady when he spoke. "I accept your challenge." Alara let the war form drop, her body shifting back to human shape. The flames died, but the heat remained, coiled in her chest like a sleeping dragon. "Tomorrow," she said. "The Moonstone Arena. Noon, in front of every pack leader in the kingdom." "Agreed," Kael said. Then he did something unexpected. He leaned closer, his voice dropping low enough that only Alara could hear. "If you wanted my attention, you could have just asked instead of threatening to burn down the kingdom." Before Alara could respond, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd with his father's advisors closing ranks around him. The council chamber descended into chaos. Nobles shouted. Pack representatives demanded explanations. The council members tried and failed to restore order as everyone talked over each other, their voices echoing off the dome ceiling in a cacophony of confusion and fear. Alara stood in the center of it all and felt nothing but cold satisfaction. She'd done it. Forced them to acknowledge her, made them give her the trial she needed to expose everything they'd tried to hide. Tomorrow at noon, the entire kingdom would watch her face Kael Draven in the arena. And they'd see exactly what the council had murdered her family to prevent. Ronan met her at the edge of the chamber, his expression caught between impressed and horrified. "That went well," he said carefully. "That went exactly how it needed to." They pushed through the crowd and out into the street, moving quickly before anyone thought to stop them. Alara kept her hood up, but she could feel eyes tracking her movement, feel the weight of whispers following her through the streets. By sunset, the entire capital would know the Ashthorn girl was alive and demanding blood. Good. Let them talk. Let them fear. Tomorrow she'd give them something worth remembering. They made it back to the inn without incident and locked themselves in the room. Ronan immediately started checking weapons while Alara stood at the window and watched the city darken as night fell. Her hands were shaking. The adrenaline that had carried her through the council chamber was fading, leaving behind exhaustion and the beginning of doubt. She'd committed herself now. There was no walking away. Tomorrow she'd stand in an arena in front of thousands of witnesses and fight the strongest alpha in the kingdom. And if she lost, if Kael killed her in that arena, the council would have exactly the narrative they wanted. The dangerous Ember Wolf eliminated legally, the threat neutralized, everything her parents died for buried with her. "Stop thinking like that," Ronan said without looking up from the blade he was sharpening. "Like what?" "Like you're already dead. I can hear it in your breathing. I'm just being realistic." "No, you're spiraling. There's a difference." He set the blade aside and turned to face her. "You stood in that chamber and made the entire council look like fools. You forced them to acknowledge you as a threat they can't just murder quietly. You did exactly what you needed to do, and tomorrow I have to follow through. Yes, and you will, because you didn't survive the marsh and weeks of brutal training just to fold in the arena." Alara wanted to believe him, but doubt was a persistent thing, and it knew exactly where to dig its claws in. She turned away from the window and started going through the motions of preparing for tomorrow, checking her clothes, organizing the evidence she'd need to present after the trial, trying to imagine what fighting Kael would actually feel like. She must have fallen asleep at some point because she woke to Ronan shaking her shoulder and pale dawn light coming through the window. "Get up, someone's here." Alara was on her feet instantly, her hand reaching for the knife under her pillow. "Who?" "No idea. But whoever it is, they knew exactly which room we're in." A soft knock came at the door. Alara moved to stand beside it, knife ready, while Ronan positioned himself on the other side. She looked at him. He nodded. She opened the door fast, blade up. Kael Draven stood in the hallway alone. He held both hands up, showing he was unarmed. "Easy. I'm not here to fight." Alara didn't lower the knife. "Then why are you here?" "Because we need to talk. Before tomorrow. Before this gets more complicated than it already is." He glanced past her into the room. "Can I come in? Or would you prefer to have this conversation in the hallway where anyone could hear?" Alara stepped back, keeping the knife ready. Kael entered and Ronan immediately moved to block the door. The room suddenly felt much smaller with all three of them inside. Kael looked around, taking in the sparse furnishings and the evidence still spread across the bed. His gaze lingered on the documents for a moment before returning to Alara. "You actually have proof?" "Yes, real proof. Not rumors or conspiracy theories, actual orders signed by council members. Why does that surprise you?" Kael was quiet for a moment. "Because I've spent my entire life being told the Ember Wolves were eliminated because they were unstable and dangerous. That it was necessary for the safety of the kingdom. That the council made a hard choice to protect everyone else." He looked at her directly. "But you're not unstable. And those documents suggest the council didn't make a hard choice. They made a profitable one." Alara lowered the knife slightly. "Did you know? When you rejected me, did you know what I was?" "No. I knew there was something unusual about you. The bond felt different than anything I'd experienced before. But I didn't know you were Ember Wolf until you cracked the marble." He moved closer, and Alara fought the instinct to step back. "The council came to me afterward, told me what you were. Said you were a threat that needed to be eliminated before you became powerful enough to challenge the kingdom's stability. They asked me to support their decision to hunt you." "And what did you say?" Kael's jaw tightened. "I said yes. Because I believed them. Because I've been raised my entire life to trust that the council acts in the kingdom's best interest." He ran a hand through his hair, frustration bleeding into his voice. "But then the assassination orders started, and the lies about what happened in the marsh, and the way my father's advisors kept telling me not to ask questions about your family's history." He pulled something from his pocket and held it out. A small leather journal, worn with age. "I found this in my father's study 2 days ago. It's a log of council decisions from the year your mother died. The vote to eliminate her was unanimous. 8 council members signed the execution order." He let that sink in. "My father was one of them." Alara stared at the journal, her mind struggling to process what she was hearing. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because tomorrow we're going to stand in that arena and fight. And I need you to know that I understand now. What was done to your family, what the council has been doing for centuries." Kael met her eyes. "I can't undo the rejection, can't take back what I said in that hall, but I can make sure that when we fight tomorrow, the truth comes out. All of it." Alara felt something cold settle in her stomach. "You're planning something. I'm planning to lose." "What?" The words came out sharp with disbelief. Kael's expression didn't change. "If I win tomorrow, the council controls the narrative. They'll say I eliminated a dangerous threat. The evidence you brought will disappear, your father's work will be buried, and nothing changes. But if you win, if I win, they execute me for being what I am. The threat is eliminated and the council still wins." "No. If you win and I survive, the council has to face questions they can't ignore. Why did the future High Alpha lose to a border wolf? What made her so dangerous? What were they really afraid of?" He stepped closer. "I'll make sure I survive the fight, wounded but alive, and then I'll stand in front of the entire kingdom and confirm everything you've accused the council of doing, with my father's journal as evidence. It was insane. It was also exactly the kind of move that could work, but there was one problem. Why would you do that? It destroys your family, your reputation, everything you've built." Kael smiled without humor. Because I've spent my entire life being groomed to rule a kingdom built on lies and murder, and I'm tired of pretending that makes me noble instead of complicit. He moved toward the door. Fight me tomorrow. Win. Make sure the entire kingdom sees what you are, and I'll make sure they understand why the council was so afraid of it. Before Alara could respond, he was gone, the door clicking shut behind him. She stood frozen in the middle of the room, her mind racing. Ronan broke the silence. Do you trust him? No. But his plan is better than anything we have. If he's telling the truth, if he actually intends to expose the council from the inside, we might have a chance to change something bigger than just my survival. And if he's lying, then I kill him in that arena, and we're back where we started. It wasn't a good answer, but it was the only one she had. The Moonstone Arena was built for spectacle. Massive stone walls rose up from the earth in a perfect circle, enclosing a floor of packed dirt that had been stained dark by centuries of blood. Tiered seating climbed toward the sky, and every seat was filled with wolves who had come to witness what everyone was calling the trial of the century. The last Ember Wolf against the future High Alpha. The forgotten Border Wolf against the kingdom's golden sun. Weakness against power. Except that wasn't the real story anymore. Alara stood in the preparation chamber beneath the arena floor and listened to the crowd roar above her. Thousands of voices blending into a sound like thunder that made the stone walls vibrate. They were expecting a show. She was going to give them a revolution. Ronan checked her armor one final time. Black leather reinforced with steel plates at the vital points, designed for mobility rather than protection. Because in the war form, protection came from claws and fire, not metal. You ready? He asked. No. Good. Means you're not overconfident. He gripped her shoulder. Remember what Celine taught you. Control the fire. Direct it. Don't let it use you. And for what it's worth, I think you're going to win. Alara wished she felt the same certainty. The sound of a horn cut through the noise above. The signal that it was time. She walked to the entrance gate and waited while mechanisms groaned and chains rattled. The gate lifted slowly, revealing the arena floor bathed in noon sunlight. Alara stepped out into that light, and the crowd's roar doubled. Across the arena, Kael emerged from the opposite gate, dressed in black armor that looked like it had been forged specifically for this fight. He moved with the easy confidence of someone who had never lost a sanctioned duel. They walked toward the center of the arena where the arbiter waited, an old wolf whose job was to ensure the fight followed the ancient rules. Both fighters stopped at the edge of the combat circle. The arbiter raised his voice to be heard over the crowd. This is trial by combat invoked under the ancient compensation laws. The challenged, Kyle Draven, has accepted. The terms are absolute. Victory through death or submission only. No outside interference. No weapons beyond natural abilities. He looked at both of them. Do you both accept these terms? Yes, Alara said. Yes, Kael answered. Then let combat begin. The arbiter stepped back. For a moment, neither fighter moved. They stood facing each other across 10 feet of empty space, and Alara saw something flicker across Kael's expression. Something that might have been regret, or determination, or both. Then he shifted. His transformation was faster than Alara expected, his body exploding into a war form that stood nearly 7 feet tall. His claws were black and serrated. His muscles rippled with power that had been honed through decades of training. He moved like violence given shape. The crowd went wild. Alara let her own shift rise slowly, deliberately. She wanted them to see it, wanted every wolf in those seats to watch as her body twisted and reformed into something their nightmares were built around. Flames erupted across her claws as the transformation completed. The crowd's cheering faltered. Then Kael attacked. He came in fast and low, claws aimed at her ribs. Alara blocked and countered, her own claws raking across his shoulder hard enough to draw blood. They broke apart and circled, both looking for openings. Kael was strong, faster than she'd anticipated, every movement precise and economical, no wasted energy. But Alara had fire. She channeled heat into her next strike, her claws glowing white-hot as they met Kael's in a shower of sparks. The smell of burning filled the arena. Kael pulled back, his arm marked with burns where her claws had connected. The fight escalated. They moved across the arena floor in a brutal dance, trading blows that would have killed normal wolves instantly. Alara's flames burned brighter with each exchange. Kael's attacks grew more aggressive, more desperate. The crowd was screaming, but Alara couldn't hear them anymore. Everything had narrowed to this moment, this fight, the weight of centuries of murdered bloodlines pressing down on her shoulders. She had to win, had to show them what the council feared, had to survive. Kael caught her with a strike that opened a gash across her ribs. Pain exploded, but the fire burned through it, sealing the wound even as blood soaked into her armor. Alara retaliated with a combination that drove Kael back toward the arena wall. Her flames were scorching the ground now, leaving blackened footprints wherever she stepped. They were both bleeding, both exhausted, both fighting with everything they had. And then Kael did something unexpected. He dropped his guard. Just for a second. Just long enough for Alara's claws to rake across his chest, tearing through armor and flesh. He went down. Alara stood over him, breathing hard, flames dancing across her raised claws. The crowd had gone silent. This was it. The moment she was supposed to finish him, to claim victory and force the council to acknowledge her. But something was wrong. Kael was looking past her toward the stands. His expression wasn't defeated, it was horrified. Alara followed his gaze. The council members were on their feet, and surrounding the arena, positioned in the stands at regular intervals, were archers, dozens of them, all with arrows nocked and aimed directly at Alara. The arrows glowed with the same enchantments the trackers had carried in the marsh. Weapons designed specifically to kill ember wolves. High Alpha Marcus's voice cut through the silence, amplified by some technique Alara didn't understand. Alara Ashthorn, you have been found guilty of using forbidden bloodline abilities in a sanctioned trial. The punishment is immediate execution. Kael pushed himself up on one elbow. Father, what are you doing? This isn't... You were supposed to kill her, boy. Not play games. Now we have to do it the hard way. Marcus raised his hand. Fire! The archers released. Kael threw himself in front of Alara. The arrows hit him instead, dozens of them, tearing through his body with sickening efficiency. He collapsed, and Alara caught him before he hit the ground, both of them crashing down into the dirt. Blood poured from his wounds, too much blood. The enchantments were burning through him, designed to kill ember wolves, devastating against anyone else. Why? Alara demanded. Why would you do that? Kael coughed, red staining his lips. Because I was wrong. About everything. And you deserved a chance to be right. He pressed something into her hand. His father's journal. Show them. Show everyone what they did. The arena exploded into chaos. Some nobles were shouting for Alara's death. Others were demanding to know why the council violated the sacred rules of trial by combat. Pack representatives were on their feet, confusion and anger spreading like wildfire through the crowd. And Alara knelt in the center of it all, holding a dying wolf who had spent his entire life being everything the kingdom wanted, only to realize at the end that everything the kingdom wanted was built on corpses and lies. She looked up at the council members standing in their elevated box, at High Alpha Marcus, who had signed her mother's death warrant, at the advisors who had spent centuries maintaining power through systematic murder, at the kingdom that had laughed when she was humiliated and was now calling for her blood. Something inside Alara broke. Not her will, not her courage, her restraint. The fire that she'd been carefully controlling, that Celine had taught her to channel and direct, exploded outward. Flames erupted from her body in a wave that swept across the arena floor. The heat was so intense that wolves in the first few rows actually scrambled back. The enchanted arrows still coming her way burned to ash before they could reach her. Alara stood, cradling Kael's journal in one hand, her body wreathed in living fire. And she finally understood what her mother had died protecting, not just power, the choice of what to do with it. She could burn this entire arena, kill everyone who had ever laughed at her weakness, reduce the council to ash and scatter their remains across the kingdom as a warning. Or she could do what her father tried to do, show them the truth, force them to face what they'd become. The fire raged around her, waiting for direction. Alara made her choice. She let the flames die. Then she activated the war form one final time and channeled every bit of remaining strength into her voice, making it carry to every corner of the arena. This council murdered my family because they were afraid of what we represented. Not violence, not chaos. Competition. The end of their monopoly on power. She held up the journal. This contains proof. Signed orders, council votes, financial records, everything you need to understand that the people ruling this kingdom have spent 2 centuries committing genocide to maintain control. She threw the journal into the stands where it landed at the feet of a pack representative from the Northern Territories. Read it, all of you. Then decide if the monsters are the bloodlines they killed or the wolves who justified murder as law. High Alpha Marcus was screaming orders. Guards were moving. The archers were trying to get clear shots, but the crowd had turned. Not everyone, not even most. But enough wolves were looking at the council with new eyes, questioning eyes. The kind of doubt that once planted grew like wildfire. Alara looked down at Kael bleeding out on the arena floor. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. Then she ran. She shifted fully into the war form and moved faster than any normal wolf could track, flames clearing a path through the chaos. Guards tried to stop her, but she burned through them. Archers fired, but their arrows couldn't catch something moving that fast. She hit the arena wall and scaled it in seconds, her claws finding purchase in stone. At the top, she paused long enough to look back. The arena was complete chaos. The council was trying to restore order and failing. Pack representatives were fighting with guards. Nobles were demanding answers. And lying in the center of it all was Kael Draven, who had betrayed his own family to give her a chance at truth. Alara turned away. She ran through the capital streets with flames trailing behind her. Ran until the buildings gave way to forest. Ran until her body couldn't sustain the war form anymore, and she collapsed in a clearing miles from the city. She'd lost everything. Her plan had failed. The trial had been a trap. Kael was dying or dead because he tried to help her. But the journal was out there, in the hands of wolves who might actually read it, and the entire kingdom had watched the council violate their own sacred laws to try to kill her, seeds planted in fire. Maybe they'd grow into something, or maybe she'd just painted a target on her back that would never wash off. Alara lay in the grass and stared up at the sky and tried to figure out what came next when every plan you made crumbled to ash, and the only thing left was survival measured in heartbeats and the desperate hope that someone, somewhere, was paying attention to the truth you'd bled for. She had become exactly what the council feared. Not a monster, a martyr. And martyrs changed kingdoms whether they survived or not. Alara woke to the smell of smoke and the sound of wolves howling in the distance. She was still in the clearing where she'd collapsed, but the sun had moved across the sky and her body had healed enough that the pain was manageable instead of unbearable. The fire inside her had burned through exhaustion and injuries, knitting flesh and restoring strength with the kind of efficiency that normal wolves could never match. That was the gift of ember blood. You never stayed broken for long. She pushed herself upright and took stock. Her armor was shredded. Her body was covered in dried blood, some of it hers, most of it Kael's. The forest around her was quiet, except for those distant howls that sounded like hunting calls. They were looking for her. Of course they were. She just burned half the arena, exposed the council's crimes in front of thousands of witnesses, and escaped through sheer violence. The kingdom wouldn't let that slide. They'd mobilize every pack, every hunter, every wolf with something to prove. And they'd keep coming until she was dead or the entire territory was on fire. Alara stood on legs that still trembled slightly and tried to figure out what direction to run. Back to the marsh meant leading them straight to Selene. North meant open territory where she'd be visible for miles. South meant crossing through packlands that were loyal to the council. Nowhere was safe. That was the truth about being hunted. Geography stopped mattering when everyone wanted you dead. She was still trying to decide when she heard movement in the trees behind her. Alara spun, claws already extending, fire already building in her chest. Ronan stepped out of the shadows with his hands raised. Easy. It's me. Relief flooded through her so fast she almost collapsed again. How did you find me? I've been tracking you since you left the arena. You're not exactly subtle when you're on fire. He moved closer, his eyes scanning her for injuries. Are you hurt? Nothing that won't heal. How bad is it back there? Ronan's expression went grim. Bad. The council declared martial law. They're saying you attacked Kael Draven unprovoked and murdered him in front of witnesses. They've put a bounty on your head that's large enough to buy a small territory. Kael's dead? The words came out flat. Empty. Ronan hesitated. I don't know. They carried him out of the arena, but I couldn't tell if he was still breathing. The council isn't releasing information.
They're too busy trying to contain the damage you caused. What damage?
Ronan almost smiled. The journal. The one you threw into the crowd. 3 different pack representatives grabbed it before the guards could. They started reading it aloud right there in the stands. The council tried to shut them down, but it was too late. Hundreds of wolves heard the evidence. He pulled a piece of paper from his pocket, and someone made copies. They're circulating through the capital right now. Every major pack leader has seen proof that the council has been systematically murdering bloodlines for 2 centuries. Alara took the paper. It was a crude reproduction of one of her father's documents, but the signature at the bottom was clear. High Alpha Marcus Draven, authorizing the execution of Mara Ashthorn. Her mother's name in black ink above the order that killed her.
So what now? She asked quietly. They hunt me down and call it justice? Maybe. Or maybe you've started something that can't be stopped. Ronan sat down on a fallen log and pulled out dried meat from his pack.
The kingdom is splitting. Some packs are supporting the council, saying you're a dangerous threat that needs to be eliminated. But others are demanding answers, demanding the council explain why they violated sacred trial laws to kill you, demanding to know how many other bloodlines were exterminated. He looked at her. You wanted to expose them. You did. Now the question is what comes next. Alara sat down beside him, suddenly exhausted again despite the fire keeping her body functional. I don't know. I thought if I got the truth out, if people saw what the council really was, that would be enough. That someone else would pick up the fight. She laughed bitterly. Stupid, right? Thinking one trial and some documents would change a system that's been in place for centuries. It's not stupid. It's optimistic. There's a difference. Ronan handed her some of the dried meat. But you're right that it's not enough. The council is wounded but not dead. They still control most of the military. They still have the support of the oldest families. And they're using their power to paint you as the villain in this story. So I need to do more than survive. I need to actually win. Yes. But winning doesn't mean killing them all. It means building something strong enough that they can't destroy it. Like what? Like a pack. A real one. Made up of wolves who've been rejected, exiled, or hunted because they didn't fit into the council's perfect hierarchy. Alara stared at him. You want me to build a pack? I want you to build an alternative. A place where bloodlines like yours can exist without being exterminated. Where power doesn't automatically mean nobility and weakness doesn't mean worthless. He stood up. The Eastern Territories are unclaimed. Too wild for most packs to bother with. But for someone with ember blood who can handle hostile terrain, it's perfect. You claim it. You build something there and you offer sanctuary to every wolf the council has wronged. It was insane. It was also exactly the kind of move that could work. Building a pack meant permanence, meant standing ground instead of running, meant becoming a target that couldn't be ignored. But it also meant having something worth defending. How long before the hunting parties find us here? Alara asked. Hours, maybe. They're sweeping outward from the capital in organized grids. We need to be moving. Then let's move east. They traveled through the night, keeping to game trails and avoiding anywhere that looked like it might have regular patrol routes. Twice they heard hunting parties in the distance and had to detour around clearings where they would have been visible. But Ronan knew the territory, and Alara's senses in the war form were sharp enough to detect threats before they became lethal. By dawn, they'd crossed into the disputed lands between pack territories where borders blurred and authority got messy. By midday, they'd reached the edge of the Eastern Territories, and Alara understood why most packs avoided this place. The land was beautiful in a hostile way. Rocky hills covered in twisted trees that looked like they'd been shaped by constant wind. Deep ravines where water rushed over sharp stones, caves and canyons that could hide anything. It was terrain that favored ambush and survival over conventional warfare, perfect for wolves who didn't plan to fight fair. They found a defensible position on a hillside overlooking a natural pass and stopped to rest and plan. Alara shifted out of the war form and tried to think like a pack alpha instead of a fugitive. What she needed was numbers, wolves willing to walk away from the established order and bet their survival on her ability to protect them. What she had was a reputation as a monster and a price on her head large enough to tempt even loyal wolves. We need to send word, she said. Let the exiles and rejected wolves know there's a place for them here. How? Ronan was already thinking. I know border scouts, wolves who work the edges of pack territories and hear things before anyone else.
If I can reach them, I can spread the message. But it'll take time. We don't have time. The council isn't going to wait for me to build an army before they come to eliminate the threat. Then we start with who we can get. The desperate ones. The angry ones. The wolves who have nothing left to lose. He looked at her directly. People like us. Over the next 3 days, word spread through unofficial channels that the Ember Wolf was claiming territory in the east and offering sanctuary to any wolf brave or desperate enough to take it. The first to arrive was a woman named Kira, scarred and missing 2 fingers on her left hand. She'd been exiled from her pack after refusing an alpha's claim. She brought nothing but the clothes on her back and a hatred for the system that had thrown her away. The second was a young man barely out of his teens named Marcus, who'd been declared weak by his alpha and cast out before he reached maturity. He was terrified of everything and carried that fear like armor. The third was a group of 5, all from different packs, all bearing the marks of wolves who'd been judged and found wanting by the rigid hierarchy the council maintained. They came slowly at first, then faster. By the end of the first week, Alara had 30 wolves camped on that hillside, all of them looking at her like she was either their salvation or their damnation. She didn't know which was true, but she started organizing them anyway, assigned positions, set up watch rotations, began training the ones who could fight and teaching the others how to survive in hostile territory. It wasn't a pack yet. It was barely an organized group, but it was something, a seed planted in rocky soil that might grow if given enough blood and fire to sustain it. Celine arrived on the 10th day, emerging from the forest like she'd been there all along. She looked Alara over with an expression that was part approval and part resignation. So you're really doing this, building something permanent. I don't have a choice. Everyone has a choice. You're choosing to stand instead of run. That's different. Celine walked through the camp, evaluating the wolves who'd gathered. Most of them shrank back when she passed, recognizing another Ember Wolf on instinct. They're weak, she said bluntly when she returned to where Alara stood. Broken, scared. Half of them will run the first time the council sends serious force against you. I know. And you're still going to try to forge them into something that can survive? Yes. Celine smiled, cold and sharp. Good. Then you're finally thinking like an alpha instead of a victim. She dropped a pack on the ground, brought supplies, weapons, some of the training equipment from the caves. If you're going to make fighters out of refugees, you'll need proper tools. Alara looked at the older woman. Why are you helping me? Because you're the last chance the Ember bloodline has to be more than a cautionary tale. Because your mother would have wanted this. Because I'm tired of hiding. Celine met her eyes. And because you're doing what I never had the courage to do. Standing up and saying the council doesn't get to decide who deserves to exist. Over the next 2 weeks, the camp transformed. Celine trained the ones who could learn to fight. Alara worked with the others, teaching them the basics of pack structure and survival. Ronan organized scouting parties to watch for threats and gather intelligence. They were building something, crude, imperfect, held together by desperation and shared trauma, but real. And then the council came for them. The warning came from a scout named Tharion, who ran into camp bleeding from a dozen wounds, his voice ragged with exhaustion. Army. Coming from the west. At least 200 soldiers. Council banners. They'll be here by tomorrow. Alara felt everything inside her go cold and clear. This was it. The moment where everything either collapsed or crystallized into something permanent. She gathered everyone in the center of camp and spoke in a voice that carried to every corner. The council is sending an army to eliminate us. They're coming because we represent everything they fear. Not violence, not chaos, choice. The possibility that power doesn't have to mean nobility and weakness doesn't have to mean worthless. She looked at the faces surrounding her, scared, exhausted, desperate. I won't lie to you. Most of us will probably die tomorrow. The council has trained soldiers, and we have refugees. They have organization, and we have hope. The odds are terrible. She let that settle. But I'm staying. I'm fighting. Because I'd rather die defending the idea that we all deserve to exist than live one more day hiding from wolves who think they have the right to decide who's worthy. She paused. Anyone who wants to leave, leave now. No judgment, no shame. You came here looking for safety, and I can't promise that anymore.
No one moved. Alara felt something crack open inside her chest. Not breaking, transforming. Then we fight. We use the terrain. We make them pay for every inch. And we show them that refugees and exiles and forgotten wolves can bleed them just as easily as they've been bleeding us. The camp erupted into preparation. Weapons were distributed. Defensive positions were established. The few wolves with combat experience started organizing the others into units that might survive first contact. Celine pulled Alara aside. You understand this is suicide, right? 200 trained soldiers against 30 terrified refugees. The math doesn't work. I know. So what's your actual plan? Survive long enough for someone to notice what's happening here. Force the council to commit resources to eliminating us in front of witnesses. Make them choose between looking weak or looking like tyrants. And if no one notices? If they just kill all of us and bury the evidence? Alara looked at her. Then we die making them work for it. Celine laughed, sharp and bitter. You really have become an alpha. Stupid, stubborn, and absolutely certain you're right, even when the entire world is telling you you're wrong. Is that a compliment? It's an observation. Whether it's a compliment depends on whether you survive tomorrow. The council's army arrived at dawn, and they were even more intimidating than the scouts had reported. 200 wolves in formation, all wearing black armor marked with the silver fang symbol. Professional soldiers who moved with the kind of coordination that only came from years of training together. They spread out across the valley below Alara's position, establishing a perimeter and siege positions with military efficiency. At the front rode a commander Alara recognized from the Grand Council, a woman named General Thrace, known for her ruthless efficiency in putting down rebellions. She rode forward alone until she was within shouting distance of Alara's defensive line. Alara Ashthorn, you and your followers are charged with rebellion against the lawful authority of the Grand Council. Surrender now, and you will be granted the mercy of a quick execution. Her voice carried across the valley without effort. Resist, and we will exterminate every wolf in that camp, your choice. Alara stepped forward to the edge of their defensive line, close enough that General Thrace could see her clearly. You want me to surrender so you can murder me quietly and pretend this never happened. But I'm done making things convenient for the council. She let fire dance across her claws, visible even in the dawn light. You want us? Come take us. But understand that every wolf who dies here dies because the council is so afraid of competition that they'd rather commit genocide than allow alternatives to exist. General Thrace's expression didn't change. So be it. She raised her hand and the army began advancing. The battle that followed was chaos. The council's soldiers hit their defensive positions with overwhelming force, trying to break through quickly before Alara's group could establish any kind of organized resistance. But the terrain was on the defenders' side. Narrow passes forced the attackers to funnel into kill zones. Rocky outcroppings provided cover. The refugees fought with the desperate ferocity of wolves who knew there was nowhere left to run. Alara moved through the battle in full war form, flames trailing from her claws as she tore through soldiers who'd probably spent their entire careers believing they were the strongest wolves alive. She killed efficiently, brutally, trying to create enough carnage that the advancing army would hesitate. Behind her, Celine fought with the cold precision of someone who'd survived decades of being hunted. Ronan coordinated the refugees, turning their lack of training into unpredictability that the soldiers couldn't easily counter. They held the first assault, and the second. By the third, the valley floor was covered in bodies, and the council's army had stopped trying to overwhelm them through sheer force. General Thrace called for a temporary halt, and her remaining soldiers pulled back to regroup. Alara collapsed against a boulder and tried to catch her breath. Her armor was destroyed. Her body was covered in cuts and burns. The fire inside her was still burning, but she could feel it starting to flicker with exhaustion. Around her, the camp was devastated. At least 15 of their original 30 were dead. Most of the survivors were wounded. They'd held against a professional army, but the cost was staggering, and the council still had over 100 soldiers ready for another assault. Celine limped over and sat down beside her, bleeding from a gash across her shoulder. That went better than expected. We're losing, slowly. That's an improvement. Despite everything, Alara almost laughed. Then Ronan came running up the hill, his expression urgent. Something's happening. The council soldiers are pulling back. All of them. They're not retreating, but they're establishing a defensive perimeter instead of pressing the attack. Why? I don't know.
But there's movement coming from the north. A lot of it. Alara pushed herself to her feet despite her body's protests and climbed to a vantage point where she could see the northern approach. What she saw made her heart stop. Wolves were pouring over the ridge. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands. They weren't wearing council colors. They were flying banners from dozens of different packs, all converging on the valley from multiple directions. And at the front, riding a massive gray wolf, was a figure Alara recognized even at this distance. Kael Draven, alive, scarred and moving stiffly, but unmistakably alive. He rode past the council's army and up the hill toward Alara's position. When he was close enough to be heard without shouting, he dismounted and walked the last few feet on legs that looked like they could barely support his weight. His armor was scorched black where the enchanted arrows had hit him. His face was pale and marked with scars that would probably never fade, but his eyes were clear, and when he spoke, his voice was steady. "I brought reinforcements." Alara stared at him, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. "You're supposed to be dead." "I was. Technically." Heart stopped for almost 3 minutes. But apparently Ember Wolffire has some interesting healing properties when it's been soaked into your wounds during a fight. He gestured at the scars covering his chest. "Your claws saved my life. The burns cauterized the arrow wounds enough that I survived long enough for healers to stabilize me." "That doesn't explain this." Kael looked back at the massive force gathering behind him. "While I was recovering, I had a lot of time to think. About what you said, about what the council did, about what kind of kingdom I wanted to help rule." He pulled out a document, official-looking with multiple signatures. "I called a vote of no confidence in the Grand Council, invoked ancient laws that haven't been used in a century, forced every major pack leader to choose between supporting the council's version of events or demanding independent investigation. 47 packs voted for investigation. 23 voted to support the council. The rest abstained." He let that sink in. "The council is fractured, and the 47 who voted against them are here. They want to hear your side, want to see proof of what you claimed, want to understand what the council was really doing for 2 centuries. Alara looked at the army spread across the valley. Wolves from territories she'd never heard of. Packs that had no reason to care about a border wolf from Black Hollow. All of them here because Kael had given them reason to question everything they thought they knew. "Why?" she asked quietly. "Why would you do this?" "Because you were right, and I was complicit in something that should have died 2 centuries ago." He met her eyes. "I can't undo the rejection, can't take back what happened in that hall, but I can make sure that what you started doesn't end with your death in an unmarked grave." General Thrace's voice cut through the moment, amplified and furious. "Kael Draven, you are in violation of direct council orders. Stand down immediately." Kael turned to face her, his stance steady despite his injuries. "The council's authority ends where its legitimacy fails. I'm exercising my right as heir to the High Alpha position to demand full investigation into charges of systemic bloodline extermination. And I'm claiming protection over the refugees gathered here until that investigation concludes. You're committing treason. I'm following laws older than your position. If that's treason, then the council is proving exactly what Alara accused them of, that they're tyrants maintaining power through fear rather than law." The standoff held for a long moment. Then one of the pack leaders from Kael's coalition rode forward, an older man with gray streaking his dark hair and the bearing of someone who'd survived decades of political warfare. His voice carried across the valley. "I am Alpha Cyrus of the Northern Ridge Pack. I second Kael Draven's demand for investigation, and I extend pack protection to the refugees under ancient sanctuary laws." Another pack leader stepped forward, then another. Within minutes, 20 pack leaders had formally claimed sanctuary protection over Alara's group, creating a legal shield that would require the council to go to war against half the kingdom to break. General Thrace looked at the coalition facing her and made the calculation that military commanders have made throughout history when the political ground shifts beneath them. She lowered her weapon. "This matter will be decided by the full council. All parties will present evidence and testimony." She looked directly at Alara. "But understand this. If the investigation finds you guilty of crimes against the kingdom, no sanctuary will save you." "Then I look forward to presenting my evidence," Alara said. The tension broke. The council's army began withdrawing.
moving in formation back toward the capital. The coalition forces held position, creating a protective perimeter around Alara's battered group. And Kael walked up the hill to stand beside Alara, both of them looking out over a valley that had almost become their mass grave. "That was close," he said quietly. "Too close. Are you going to be ready for what comes next?" The investigation. The testimony. Standing in front of the entire kingdom and making them see what the council really is? Alara looked at the refugees gathering around her, wounded, exhausted, but alive, building something that hadn't existed before. "I've been ready since the moment they killed my mother. I just didn't know it yet." Kael nodded slowly. "For what it's worth, I'm sorry. For the rejection. For not seeing what was happening. For being part of the system that hurt you." Alara turned to look at him. "Sorry doesn't fix anything, but standing here does. Making them face what they've done does. That's worth something." She held out her hand. "Truce?" Kael took it, and his grip was steady despite the injuries still healing beneath his armor. "Truce. Until the council falls, or we do." The sun was setting over the eastern territories, painting the sky in shades of fire and blood. In the valley below, wolves from dozens of packs were setting up camps, creating something that looked almost like a temporary city. A coalition of the willing and the angry, and the ones who'd finally had enough of being told what power was allowed to look like. Alara stood at the center of it and felt something shift inside her chest. Not the fire this time. Something colder. Harder. Determination. The council would come for her again. With lawyers instead of soldiers. With political maneuvering instead of arrows. But they would come because she represented everything they'd spent centuries trying to suppress. And this time, she wouldn't be alone. This time, she had an army of wolves who'd been thrown away by the system and were ready to tear it down. This time, she had proof that couldn't be buried. This time, she had Kael Draven standing beside her instead of against her, and his presence legitimized everything she was fighting for. The investigation would be brutal. The testimony would reopen wounds that had been buried for generations. The truth would hurt everyone involved, but truth was the only weapon strong enough to kill the lies the council had built its power on. Celine appeared at her shoulder, silent as always. "You ready for this? The real fight. Not swords and claws, but words and laws and political warfare." "No." "Good. Means you understand what you're walking into." The older woman looked out at the gathered forces. "Your mother would have been proud, terrified, but proud." Alara touched the satchel at her side, feeling the weight of her father's journal inside. "I hope so. Because if this fails, if the council wins anyway, then everything they died for dies with us. Then don't let it fail." Celine's voice was hard as stone. "You're Ember Wolf. We don't break. We burn everything down and rise from the ashes. That's what we do. That's what you're going to do." She turned to walk away, then paused. "And Alara, when this is over, when the council has fallen or you have, remember something. You didn't start this fight to win. You started it because someone had to. That's what makes you dangerous. Not the fire, not the claws. The fact that you're willing to burn for something bigger than survival." She disappeared into the growing darkness, leaving Alara standing on that hillside with an army at her back and a kingdom's worth of secrets ready to destroy everything the council had built. Tomorrow they would march to the capital, would stand in front of the entire kingdom and force every pack leader to choose between comfortable lies and uncomfortable truths. Would finally answer the question that had been building since the moment Kael rejected her in that hall. What happened when the forgotten wolves stopped accepting their place at the bottom and demanded to be seen as something more than mistakes written in weak blood? What happened when the exiles and refugees and broken ones stood up and said the system that threw them away was the problem, not them? What happened when an Ember Wolf stopped running and started burning? The kingdom was about to find out, and nothing would ever be the same again. The march to the capital took 3 days, and every hour the coalition grew larger. Wolves emerged from a territories Alara had never heard of, drawn by rumors that someone was finally challenging the council's authority with more than empty threats. They came with scars and stories, each one carrying proof of how the system had failed them. Rejected mates, exiled pack members, wolves whose bloodlines had been deemed insufficient by councils that valued pedigree over survival. By the time they reached the gates of Valenheart, the coalition numbered over 2,000. It wasn't an army in the traditional sense. There was no unified command structure, no matching uniforms, no coordinated battle tactics. But there was something more dangerous than military precision. There was shared rage tempered by years of being told they didn't matter. And rage like that, when given direction and legitimacy, could reshape kingdoms. The capital's gates stood open. The council had clearly decided that closing them would look like fear, and fear would undermine the narrative they'd spent weeks constructing. That Alara was a dangerous criminal, that the coalition was misguided at best and treasonous at worst, that order must be maintained even if it required harsh measures. But open gates also meant witnesses. Thousands of city wolves lined the streets as the coalition entered, watching in silence as the forgotten and discarded marched past wearing their scars like badges of honor. Some faces showed contempt, others showed confusion, but more than a few showed recognition, like they were seeing their own stories reflected in these refugees and wondering when they'd stop noticing. The Grand Council had called for a formal hearing in the central plaza rather than the council chamber. Smart move. The plaza could hold 10,000 wolves, which meant the proceedings would be public in a way that couldn't be controlled or edited later. Whatever happened here would be witnessed by half the capital. Alara walked at the front of the coalition alongside Kael, both of them silent as they moved through streets that had laughed at her humiliation mere weeks ago. Behind them came Celine and Ronan, then the pack leaders who'd staked their authority on this investigation being legitimate. The plaza was already packed when they arrived. The council sat on an elevated platform at the far end, all 12 members present and wearing their full ceremonial regalia. High Alpha Marcus occupied the central seat, his expression carved from stone, revealing nothing. Around the edges of the plaza stood peacekeepers in formation, enough to put down a riot, but not enough to fight an army. Another calculated decision. The council wanted to project strength without looking like tyrants. Too late for that, Alara thought. The crowd parted as the coalition entered the plaza, creating a corridor that led directly to a space marked off in front of the council's platform. The petitioners' circle, same as in the council chamber, but scaled up for public spectacle. Alara stepped into that circle with her father's satchel clutched against her side and tried to steady her breathing. This was it. The moment everything had been building toward. No more running, no more fighting, just words and evidence and the desperate hope that truth still mattered to wolves who'd spent centuries being told comfortable lies. High Alpha Marcus's voice carried across the plaza, amplified by some technique that made it sound like he was speaking directly into every wolf's ear. This hearing has been called to address accusations of systemic corruption within the Grand Council. The accused is Alara Ashthorn of Black Hollow Pack, who claims the council has spent 2 centuries exterminating bloodlines deemed dangerous. The council denies these accusations and requests the opportunity to present counter-evidence. He paused, letting that settle. However, due to the severity of the charges and the number of packs demanding investigation, we have agreed to public testimony. Both sides will present evidence. Witnesses will be called. And at the conclusion, every pack leader present will vote on whether the accusations have merit. His eyes fixed on Alara. You demanded this platform, girl. Now use it. Present your evidence or admit your accusations are baseless. Alara stepped forward to the edge of the circle where everyone could see her clearly. Her voice came out steady despite the fear coiled in her chest. I accuse this council of genocide. Not the quick kind done in open battle, but the slow kind. The methodical kind. The kind where you identify bloodlines with abilities you can't control and eliminate them one by one over decades until everyone forgets they ever existed. She pulled the first document from her satchel. This is a council vote from 24 years ago. The motion was whether to eliminate the Ember Wolf bloodline completely. The vote was unanimous. 12 council members, including High Alpha Marcus, voted yes. She held up the document long enough for wolves in the front rows to see the signatures. My mother's name is on this list. Mara Ashthorn, marked for elimination because her blood carried fire. She let the paper fall. This is the assassination order that killed her, signed by council member Tharion, disguised as an accident involving a territorial dispute that never actually happened. Another document hit the ground. The lies continued, each one documented in her father's meticulous handwriting. Orders for executions, records of bloodlines that had been systematically eliminated, testimony from survivors who'd gone into hiding after watching their families murdered. With each piece of evidence, the crowd grew quieter, angrier. The kind of anger that came from realizing you'd been lied to about something fundamental. When Alara finished, the pile of documents at her feet looked like a paper grave marker for 2 centuries of systematic murder. She looked up at the council. My father spent 15 years gathering this evidence. The council killed him before he could present it, but they didn't find his records, and now every wolf here can see exactly what kind of kingdom we've been living in. High Alpha Marcus's expression hadn't changed. Compelling documents, but documents can be forged. Do you have any witnesses who can verify these accusations? Yes. Alara turned to look at the crowd. Every wolf standing behind me is a witness. Every exile, every rejected mate, every wolf deemed insufficient by councils that value bloodlines over survival. They're living proof of a system that throws away anyone who doesn't fit the acceptable model of what power should look like. She gestured at the coalition. But you want someone more official? Someone whose word carries weight in your hierarchy? She looked at Kyle. He stepped into the circle beside her, moving stiffly but with purpose. When he spoke, his voice carried the same authority his father's had, the weight of generations of leadership behind every word. I am Kyle Draven, heir to the High Alpha position, and I confirm everything Alara has accused the council of doing. The plaza erupted. Nobles shouted denials. Pack leaders demanded explanations. The council members were on their feet, several of them talking at once. High Alpha. Marcus raised his hand and the noise died gradually. You're my son. I'm supposed to uphold the laws that built this kingdom. Laws that say power comes with responsibility. That authority requires legitimacy. That leadership means protecting all wolves, not just the ones born with the right bloodlines. Kale pulled out his own evidence, the journal he'd taken from his father's study. I found this 2 weeks ago. It's a personal log detailing council decisions going back 30 years. Every vote to eliminate a bloodline, every assassination approved, every cover story manufactured. He opened it to a marked page. This entry is from the week after Alara's mother died. My father wrote about how necessary it was, how dangerous Ember Wolves were, how eliminating them was the only way to maintain stability. He closed the journal. I grew up believing my father was a great leader, that the council made hard choices for the good of the kingdom. But this isn't leadership. This is genocide with paperwork. High Alpha Marcus stood slowly, his expression finally showing something beyond calculated neutrality. Rage, pure and cold. You betray your own blood for this girl? For these refugees? I'm honoring my blood by refusing to continue what you started. The Draven line is supposed to stand for strength and justice, not murder and cover-ups. Marcus's jaw tightened. You're a fool. You think exposing this will make things better? All you've done is destabilize a system that's kept this kingdom functioning for centuries. A system built on corpses isn't functioning, it's rotting from the inside. The confrontation between father and son held the entire plaza captive. This wasn't just about Alara anymore. This was about what kind of kingdom Veyr would become. Whether it would continue down the path of systematic elimination or evolve into something that could accommodate wolves who didn't fit the traditional power structure. Then one of the coalition pack leaders stepped forward. Alpha Cyrus, the older man who'd been first to claim sanctuary protection. His voice cut through the tension. I call for a vote. Every pack leader present will decide whether the evidence presented today proves systematic corruption within the Grand Council. If the majority votes yes, the current council is dissolved and new leadership is elected under the ancient laws. The crowd held its breath. High Alpha Marcus looked around the plaza at thousands of faces, many of them hostile, and made the calculation that leaders throughout history have made when they realize their authority has crumbled beneath them. He could fight, could call in the full military and put down this challenge through force, could arrest everyone in the coalition and execute them as traitors, or he could accept that the kingdom had changed whether he wanted it to or not. Very well, he said finally. We'll vote. Every pack leader present casts their judgment. Majority decides the council's fate. The voting took an hour. Each pack leader stood and declared their position publicly, their voice recorded by council scribes for the official record. The process was designed to be transparent, to make sure no one could later claim they'd been coerced or misunderstood. 43 packs voted that the evidence proved corruption. 20 packs voted that the evidence was insufficient. 12 packs abstained. The council fell with a simple majority and the weight of 2 centuries of accumulated crimes. High Alpha Marcus stood as the final count was announced, his expression unreadable. Then he did something Alara never expected. He looked directly at her and spoke clearly enough for everyone to hear. "You've won, girl. The council is dissolved. New leadership will be elected. The old system is dead." He paused. "I hope you understand what you've unleashed, because breaking something is easy. Building what comes after is the hard part." Then he walked off the platform, his remaining loyal council members following in silence. The plaza erupted into chaos. Some wolves celebrated. Others looked shell-shocked. Pack leaders immediately began arguing about what came next, how to structure new governance, who would lead during the transition. But Alara just stood in the center of it all and tried to process what had just happened. She'd won. After everything. After the rejection and the hunting and the battles and the testimony, after watching her mother die and discovering her father's work and learning to control fire that wanted to burn everything. She'd actually won. Kale appeared at her shoulder, his expression weary but satisfied. "It's done. For now." He smiled slightly. "You're not celebrating? I'm trying to figure out what comes next. Your father was right about one thing. I broke the system, but I don't know how to build what replaces it. Nobody does. That's why it'll take all of us." He gestured at the coalition scattered through the plaza. "These wolves didn't follow you because you had all the answers. They followed you because you were willing to ask the questions everyone else was too afraid to voice." Alara looked at him, this wolf who'd rejected her in front of hundreds, and then risked everything to stand beside her when it mattered most. "Why did you do it? Really? You could have stayed quiet. Let the council fall without tying yourself to me." "Because I was taught my entire life that leadership means making the hard choices. And the hardest choice I ever made was admitting I was wrong about everything I'd been taught to believe." He met her eyes. "You showed me that strength doesn't mean dominating everyone around you. It means having the courage to stand up even when you're terrified, even when the odds are impossible, even when everyone tells you to be quiet and accept your place." He held out his hand. "The mate bond is gone. We destroyed it ourselves. But that doesn't mean we can't build something else. An alliance between old power and new, between the wolves who fit the system and the ones who never did." Alara looked at his offered hand, thinking about everything that had led to this moment. The rejection that had shattered her world, the journey that had forged her into something stronger, the evidence that had brought down a kingdom's worth of lies. And she realized something fundamental about power and how it worked in the real world, not the stories nobles told themselves. True strength wasn't about dominating others. It was about lifting them up when the system knocked them down. About standing beside wolves who'd been told they didn't matter and proving that narrative wrong through sheer stubborn refusal to accept it. Her mother had hidden to survive. Her father had gathered evidence to expose. Celine had taught her to fight. But Alara had learned something they never could have taught, that survival wasn't enough, that exposing crimes wasn't enough, that even winning wasn't enough. What mattered was what you built after the victory in the space where the old system used to stand. She took Kale's hand, not as mates, not as romantic partners, but as allies committed to building something better than what came before. "The Eastern Territories are still unclaimed," she said. "I'm going back there. Building a real pack from the refugees and exiles, a place where bloodlines don't determine worth and power doesn't automatically mean leadership." Kale nodded slowly. "And I'll stay here, help establish new governance, make sure the transition doesn't collapse into civil war. Keep the old families from just recreating what we tore down. So we're splitting up. We're covering more ground. Building from 2 directions instead of 1. He smiled. "Besides, you're going to need someone in the capital who can run interference when the nobles start complaining about the dangerous Ember Wolf building an army in the east. They're going to complain, constantly. But they'll also be too busy rebuilding their own power structures to do much about it. For a while, at least. The implications settled between them. This wasn't an ending, it was a beginning. Messy and uncertain, and probably full of conflicts they couldn't predict yet. But it was theirs, built on truth instead of comfortable lies, on choice instead of obligation, on the radical idea that every wolf deserved a chance to prove what they could become when the system stopped telling them they weren't enough. Over the next week, the capital transformed. The old council was formally disbanded. Emergency governance was established with representatives from multiple packs sharing authority until proper elections could be organized. The evidence Alara and her father had gathered was copied and distributed to every major pack, ensuring the truth couldn't be buried again. And wolves started talking, not just about the council's crimes, but about the system that had enabled them. About how many talented wolves had been discarded because they didn't fit narrow definitions of strength. About how much potential had been wasted defending a hierarchy that valued bloodlines over ability. The conversations were uncomfortable, angry, sometimes violent as old power structures resisted change, but they were happening, and that was what mattered. Alara spent those days preparing to return east, gathering supplies, organizing the refugees who'd followed her into something resembling a functional pack, making plans for the territory they'd claim and the sanctuary they'd build. On the last night before departure, Celine found her standing on the walls overlooking the city. "You're really going through with this. Building something permanent. I have to. All those wolves who followed me into battle, who stood up when it would have been safer to stay quiet. I owe them more than just survival. I owe them a place where they can thrive." Celine was quiet for a moment. "Your mother would have been proud and terrified, but mostly proud. I wish she could have seen this, seen the council fall, seen that hiding wasn't the only option. She saw more than you think. She knew what you could become. That's why she hid you so carefully, so you'd survive long enough to be ready when the moment came." Celine looked out at the city lights spreading below. "I'm coming with you, to the Eastern Territories. Someone needs to make sure you don't burn down your own pack by accident." "Despite everything," Alara smiled. "Because you care about me or because you're bored hiding in swamps?" "Both. Mostly the second thing, but a little bit the first." They stood in silence for a while, two ember wolves looking out over a kingdom that had tried to eliminate them and failed. Then Celine spoke again, her voice carrying the weight of someone who'd survived longer than she'd ever expected to. "Remember something, Alara. What you build in those territories won't be perfect. You'll make mistakes. Some wolves will leave. Others will challenge your authority. There will be days when you wonder if any of this was worth it. And on those days, remember that you didn't fight all this way just to create another version of what we tore down. You fought for the right to fail on your own terms, to build something imperfect but honest, to prove that strength comes in forms the old kingdom never wanted to acknowledge. That's the real victory. Not tearing down the council, but having the courage to build something different in its place." The Eastern Territories looked different when Alara returned with over 300 wolves following behind her. The rocky hills and twisted trees were still hostile, still dangerous, still exactly the kind of place that would test anyone trying to claim it. But now they looked like possibility instead of exile, like territory that could be shaped into something new instead of just somewhere to hide. They built slowly, carefully, learning as they went. The first structures were simple, shelters against weather, storage for supplies, a central gathering space where pack business could be conducted. But gradually those simple structures became more elaborate. Permanent buildings, training grounds, a hall large enough for the entire pack to gather. They called it the Ember Pack, and the name spread through the kingdom like fire through dry grass. Some packs viewed them as a threat, others saw them as an opportunity. But everyone agreed they were something that couldn't be ignored. Alara led them with the same stubborn determination that had carried her through everything else. She made mistakes, learned from them, adjusted. She listened to wolves who'd been leaders before and wolves who'd never led anything but knew what they needed. She built something imperfect but real. And wolves kept coming. Rejected mates, exiled pack members, wolves whose abilities didn't fit traditional categories. They arrived in small groups at first, then larger ones, drawn by rumors that somewhere in the East there was a pack that valued survival and loyalty over bloodlines and politics. Within a year, the Ember Pack numbered over 500. Within 2 years, they'd established formal trade agreements with neighboring territories. Within 3 years, even the old noble families had stopped openly calling for their elimination, though the whispers never entirely stopped. Kyle visited twice during those first years, always officially on diplomatic business, always staying just long enough to see how things were developing. On his second visit, he found Alara standing on the cliffs overlooking the territory she'd claimed,
watching wolves train in the valley below.
It's impressive, he said without preamble. What you've built here, it's messy and chaotic and held together with hope and stubbornness. Like I said, impressive. He stood beside her, both of them looking out over the territory in silence. Things are changing in the capital too. Slower than either of us wanted, but changing. The new council has representatives from bloodlines that would never have been considered before. The laws are being rewritten to include protection for wolves who don't fit traditional categories. That's good. It's a start. More silence. Then Kael spoke again, his voice carrying something that might have been regret. I think about that night sometimes. The rejection. What I said in front of everyone. How differently things might have gone if I'd just been brave enough to stand beside you from the beginning. Alara turned to look at him. If you'd stood beside me from the beginning, none of this would have happened. I would have stayed weak and forgettable. The council's crimes would have stayed buried. All those wolves down there would still be exiles with nowhere to go. She looked back at the territory spreading below. Sometimes the worst thing that happens to you becomes the thing that makes everything else possible. The rejection broke me, but what grew back was stronger than what broke. Is that forgiveness? Alara thought about that. It's acceptance. Acceptance that we were both shaped by a system that told us there was only one way to be strong, and we both had to break before we could learn different. She met his eyes. The mate bond is gone. We destroyed it. But I don't hate you for what happened. I'm almost grateful. Because everything I am now, everything I've built, came from refusing to accept what you said about me in that hall. Kael nodded slowly. For what it's worth, I was wrong. About you being weak. About what strength looks like. About everything. I know. They stood together on that cliff for a while longer. Two wolves who'd been tied together by fate and torn apart by choice and found something more valuable than romance in the rebuilding. They found respect. And respect, Alara had learned, was a stronger foundation than any bond nature could force on you. 5 years after the council fell, Alara stood in the same spot on the cliffs and looked out over a territory that had been transformed. The Ember Pack now numbered over 800. They'd established permanent settlements across the eastern territories. Trade routes ran through their lands. Other packs sought alliances instead of conflicts. They'd become legitimate, not powerful in the way the old noble families measured power, through bloodlines and political maneuvering, but powerful in the way that mattered, through loyalty and choice, and the proven ability to survive when everyone said they shouldn't be able to. Ronan appeared at her shoulder, older now, scarred from years of defending territory that everyone wanted to test. Council meeting in an hour. The Northern Packs want to discuss border adjustments again. They always want to discuss border adjustments. Tell them the same thing we told them last time. Our borders stay where they are until we decide to move them. He smiled. You've gotten very good at the political side of this. I've had practice. 5 years of being challenged by every pack that thinks we're weak because we accept exiles. And proving them wrong every time. That too. Ronan hesitated, then spoke again. There's something else. A message came from the capital. From Kael. He says there's a young wolf in one of the northern packs showing signs of a rare bloodline. The pack Alpha wants to eliminate her before she becomes dangerous. Alara felt fire spark in her chest. How old? 14. Just starting to manifest abilities. Send a response. Tell them the Ember Pack claims sanctuary rights. And if they touch that girl, we'll consider it an act of war. You sure you want to pick that fight? Alara looked out at the territory she'd built from nothing but stubbornness and fire. I didn't survive everything I survived just to let other wolves repeat the same crimes in a different form. If they want to eliminate rare bloodlines, they'll have to go through us first. She turned to face Ronan directly. Send the message, and start preparing a delegation. If that pack won't release the girl voluntarily, we'll go get her. This is why they're afraid of you, Not because you're Ember Wolf, because you won't stay in your lane, won't accept that some fights aren't yours to pick. Every fight about whether wolves deserve to exist is my fight. That's what the Ember Pack means. That's what we built this place for. Ronan nodded, satisfied. I'll prepare the delegation. He walked away, leaving Alara alone on the cliffs with her thoughts and the weight of leadership she'd never asked for but had learned to carry. She thought about her mother, who'd hidden to survive. About her father, who'd gathered evidence to expose. About Celine, who'd survived by being dangerous enough that no one wanted to test her. And she thought about herself, the forgotten border wolf who'd been rejected in front of hundreds, and decided that rejection wasn't the end of her story. It was just the beginning. The moment when she stopped accepting what others said she was and started defining it for herself. That night, Alara stood in the central hall and addressed the entire pack. Over 800 wolves gathered to hear their alpha speak, and the silence when she raised her hand was absolute. 5 years ago, I stood in a grand hall and let someone tell me I was worthless, that my blood was weak, that I didn't deserve to exist beside wolves born with better bloodlines. She let that settle. I believed him for about 30 seconds. Then I rejected him back and cracked the floor beneath my feet and learned that power doesn't come from bloodlines. It comes from refusing to let anyone else define what you're worth. She looked out at faces that carried every kind of scar and story. Every wolf here knows what it means to be thrown away, to be told you're not enough, to be rejected by systems that value arbitrary measures over actual survival. But you're here anyway. You survived anyway. And together we've built something that terrifies the old families because it proves everything they believed about power and worth was a lie. She paused. Tomorrow we're going to the Northern Territories. We're going to claim sanctuary rights over a 14-year-old girl whose only crime is manifesting abilities her pack doesn't understand. And we're going to bring her here where she can learn to control her power without being told she's a monster for having it. Some of you will think that's not our fight, that we should focus on protecting what we've built instead of expanding into conflicts that might get us killed. She met their eyes, each one. But if we're not willing to stand up for wolves who remind us of ourselves, then we've just become another version of what we tore down, just another hierarchy deciding who deserves protection and who doesn't. The hall erupted in howls of agreement, and Alara felt something settle inside her chest. Not the fire this time. Something quieter, but just as powerful. Purpose. She'd spent 5 years building a sanctuary. Now it was time to make sure that sanctuary meant something beyond just the wolves who'd already reached it. Time to extend protection to the ones still running, still hiding, still waiting for someone to tell them they deserve to exist without apologizing for it. That was what the Ember Pack was for. That was what she'd become Alpha for. Not to rule through fear or domination, but to stand between the forgotten and the systems that wanted them eliminated, and dare anyone to try getting through her. The delegation left at dawn, 30 wolves moving fast through territory that most packs avoided. They traveled light and ready for conflict because claiming sanctuary rights over another pack's territory was the kind of move that often led to violence. But they traveled anyway. Because that was what being Ember Pack meant. Standing up even when it was dangerous. Especially when it was dangerous. 3 days later, they returned with a terrified 14-year-old girl whose hands sparked with electricity she couldn't control and whose pack had been planning her execution for being too dangerous to live. Alara brought her to the training grounds where Celine was waiting. The old woman looked the girl over with practiced eyes. Storm bloodline. Rare. Powerful. Unstable if not properly trained. She looked at Alara. You realize keeping her alive makes us a target for every pack that fears rare abilities? I'm counting on it. Let them come. Let them see that we'll defend what we claim, that wolves with unusual gifts have somewhere to go besides graves. Celine smiled, cold and proud. You finally figured it out. Figured what out? That being alpha doesn't mean being the strongest wolf in the pack. It means being willing to stand between your wolves and everything that wants them dead, even when the odds are impossible. She turned to the girl. Come on. Let's teach you how to make that electricity do what you want instead of what it wants. They walked away. The old Ember Wolf and the young Storm bloodline, heading toward training grounds where power would be shaped instead of feared. And Alara stood watching them and felt the weight of 5 years of leadership settle more comfortably across her shoulders. This was her life now. Claiming wolves the kingdom wanted dead, training them, protecting them, building something that valued survival and loyalty over bloodlines written in ancient records. It was exhausting. It was dangerous. It was exactly what she was meant to do. That night, Alara returned to the cliffs where she did her best thinking and found Kael waiting for her. He visited more often now, as the capital settled into new patterns and his presence was less critical to maintaining the fragile peace. "I heard about the Northern Pack situation," he said. "That was bold. That was necessary. The distinction is getting harder to tell with you." Alara sat down beside him, both of them looking out over territory that had been wilderness 5 years ago and was now home to hundreds of wolves who'd been told they didn't belong anywhere. "How are things in the capital?" "Complicated. The new council works, but it's messy. Every decision takes 3 times longer because we have to negotiate between factions that used to solve disagreements through force. But it's working. It's working, slowly, but working." He looked at her. "You ever regret it? Walking away from the capital? Building out here instead of staying and fighting for political power?" "Every day. And then I see wolves like that girl we brought back and remember why I'm here." She met his eyes. "Political power is important. Someone needs to be in the capital rewriting laws and keeping the old families from recreating what we destroyed. But this is where I belong, out here with the refugees and exiles, building something that proves the system was wrong about us." Kael nodded slowly. "For what it's worth, I think you made the right choice. The kingdom needs both. Wolves in the capital changing things from inside, and wolves like you proving change is possible from outside. We make a good team. For wolves who destroyed their mate bond, we make a better team because we destroyed it. Freed from obligation and able to choose partnership instead." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun set over the eastern territories, painting everything in shades of fire and gold. Two wolves who'd been tied together by fate and torn apart by pain and found something stronger than any bond in the rebuilding. Found respect in alliance and the shared understanding that sometimes the worst thing that happens becomes the foundation for everything good that follows. 7 years after the council fell, after the kingdom split and reformed and learned to accommodate wolves it had spent centuries trying to eliminate, Alara stood on those same cliffs and realized something fundamental had shifted. She wasn't running anymore, wasn't hiding, wasn't constantly braced for the next attack or the next challenge or the next wolf telling her she didn't deserve to exist. She was standing, building, leading. She had become exactly what the old kingdom feared, not because she was violent or unstable or dangerous in the way they'd painted ember wolves, but because she represented choice, the radical idea that power could take forms they'd never wanted to acknowledge, that strength could mean protection instead of domination, that leadership could be earned through loyalty instead of inherited through bloodlines. Behind her, the Ember Pack had grown to over 1,000 strong. They'd established permanent territories, created laws that protected wolves the kingdom had abandoned, built alliances with packs that valued survival over pedigree. They'd become legitimate without becoming traditional. And that was the real victory. Not destroying the council, not exposing the crimes, not even surviving when everyone said she shouldn't be able to. The victory was building something new, something that proved the old way wasn't the only way, something that gave rejected and forgotten wolves a place to become whatever they were capable of becoming without systems telling them they weren't enough. Celine found her on the cliffs one last time, older now, moving slower, but still sharp and dangerous. "You've done well," she said without preamble. "Built something worth building. We built something. All of us." "No. You built it. We just helped keep it standing while you figured out how." Elena sat down beside her, both of them looking out over territory that had been worthless 7 years ago and was now the foundation of something that would outlive them both. "Your mother would have been proud. Terrified. But proud. I hope so. I know so. Because she spent her whole life hiding to keep you safe, and you spent yours refusing to hide so others wouldn't have to." Celine was quiet for a moment. "I'm dying, by the way. The fire's burning out. Could be months, could be weeks. But I wanted you to know." Alara felt something cold settle in her chest. "Is there anything—" "No. This is how ember wolves go. The fire burns bright, and then it burns out, and there's nothing left but ash. I've had a good run, survived longer than anyone expected." She looked at Alara. "But before I go, I need you to understand something. What you built here, it's fragile. It works because you're holding it together. But eventually you'll be gone too, and someone else will have to carry it forward. Make sure you're training wolves who understand what this place means, not just as sanctuary, but as proof that the kingdom was wrong about power and worth and who deserves to survive. I will. Good. They sat in silence as the sun set over the territories one last time together. Two ember wolves, old and young, looking out over a kingdom that had tried to exterminate them and failed. 6 months later, Selene died quietly in her sleep, the fire burning out after decades of keeping her alive past when nature said she should have fallen. The Ember Pack mourned her as a warrior and teacher, and the last guardian of a bloodline that had almost disappeared from history. And Alara stood over her pyre and spoke words that would be remembered long after both of them were ash. She taught me that power without purpose is just violence, that strength means standing up for wolves who can't stand for themselves, that surviving isn't enough. You have to survive for something. She paused. The Ember bloodline was nearly exterminated because the kingdom feared what we represented, not violence, not chaos, competition, the end of their monopoly on who got to decide what strength looked like. Selene survived that extermination, lived long enough to teach me everything she knew, long enough to see the council fall and the Ember Pack rise. She died knowing that what the kingdom tried to destroy had come back stronger than anyone imagined possible. The fire consumed Selene's body, bright and hot and final. And Alara stood watching until there was nothing left but ash spreading on the wind, carrying the last guardian of the old Ember Wolves out into a kingdom that would never forget what they'd represented. 10 years after the rejection that changed everything, Alara stood in the central hall and addressed a pack that numbered over 1,500 strong. Wolves from territories across the kingdom. Wolves carrying bloodlines that would have gotten them killed a decade ago. Wolves who'd found sanctuary and survival and the freedom to be dangerous without being called monsters for it. We've spent 10 years building something the kingdom said couldn't exist. A pack that values survival over bloodlines, that protects wolves who don't fit traditional categories, that proves strength comes in forms the old system never wanted to acknowledge. She looked out at faces that had learned to meet her eyes instead of lowering them in submission. Some of you were here from the beginning, others arrived last week, but all of you understand what this place means, what we're defending, what we've proven just by surviving. She paused. The old council is gone. The laws have been rewritten. The kingdom is slowly learning to accommodate wolves it used to eliminate. But that doesn't mean the fight is over. There are still packs that fear rare bloodlines. Still alphas who eliminate wolves for not fitting their narrow definitions of acceptable. Still systems that value pedigree over ability. And as long as that's true, the Ember Pack stands as proof that those systems are wrong, as sanctuary for wolves who need somewhere to go, as the alternative that shouldn't exist but does anyway. The hall erupted in howls that shook the rafters, and Alara stood at the center of it feeling something she'd never expected to feel. Peace. Not the absence of conflict, the knowledge that she'd found her purpose and fulfilled it, that the forgotten border wolf who'd been rejected in front of hundreds had become exactly what she needed to become, not through domination or violence or political maneuvering, but through stubborn refusal to let anyone else define what she was worth. That night, Alara walked the borders of her territory alone, something she did once a month to remind herself how far they'd come. She passed training grounds where young wolves learned to control abilities that would have gotten them killed a decade ago, past halls where exiles and refugees had become pack members with voices and authority, past everything she'd built from nothing but fire and stubbornness and the desperate hope that truth still mattered. She reached the cliffs where she did her best thinking and found no one waiting this time. Just silence and starlight and the weight of a decade spent proving that rejected wolves could build something worth remembering. Alara stood on those cliffs and looked out over territory that had been wilderness when she first arrived. Territory that was now home to over 1,500 wolves who'd been told they didn't matter and had learned differently through sheer stubborn survival. She thought about her mother, who'd hidden to protect her, about her father, who'd gathered evidence to expose the truth, about Selene, who'd taught her to fight, about Kael, who'd learned to stand beside her after first tearing her down, about Ronan, who'd never abandoned her even when staying was dangerous. And she thought about herself. The border wolf who'd been rejected in front of hundreds and decided that rejection wasn't an ending, it was permission. Permission to stop trying to fit into systems that were never designed for wolves like her. Permission to build something new instead of begging for acceptance in something old. Permission to be dangerous and powerful and uncompromising without apologizing for taking up space. The kingdom had worshipped power when she was nothing. Now they feared her power because she'd proven that strength didn't belong to bloodlines that could trace themselves back through centuries of careful breeding. It belonged to anyone stubborn enough to stand up when the world said they should stay down. Alara let fire dance across her fingertips as dawn broke over the eastern territories, painting everything in shades of gold and crimson. And she finally understood what her mother had been protecting all those years ago. Not just survival, the choice of what to do with it. The freedom to become something the kingdom said couldn't exist and prove through sheer existence that the kingdom was wrong. The Ember Pack would outlive her, would grow and change and face challenges she couldn't predict, would probably make mistakes and suffer losses and struggle with everything that came with being something new in a kingdom built on ancient traditions. But it would survive, because she'd built it on truth instead of lies, on choice instead of obligation, on the radical idea that every wolf deserved a chance to prove what they could become when the system stopped telling them they weren't enough. Maybe the old kingdoms would never stop fearing her. Maybe they would, but they would never again decide who deserved to exist. That choice belonged to the wolves themselves now, and Alara had spent 10 years making sure they remembered it.